Chapter 276 Lu Yin's Waking Up. The storm lasted 4 days. 4 days, each more difficult than the other. If the wind could be considered icy on the first day, this adjective proved to be an understatement for the next 3 days. By the morning of the second day, the wind had reached speeds well above the level of a hurricane, and a human weighing less than 100 kilos would not be able to set foot outside or else face the risk of being blown away to new skies. Incidentally, this was the least of their concerns. Hailstones originally the size of a pine cone had quickly reached the diameter of a coconut, and the speed of the falling ice projectiles had more than doubled. Even at his peak, Jake would have had to think twice before venturing out into the blizzard. Naturally, the temperatures had plummeted, and the fire in the chimney had soon been no longer enough to warm their stone abode. With Jake away and asleep anyway, Sarah and Kevin had to be even more resourceful in keeping the injured alive. In the end, it was human warmth that ultimately came to the rescue when the fire and furs were no longer enough. Kevin and Sarah had simply huddled up with the 2 children and warmed them with their own body heat. To his dismay, Kevin had to keep his bestial form, because it was particularly adapted to withstand low temperatures, and this freed up the available blankets. In spite of all their preparations, it was true that Jake had never intended to house so many people, and especially had not anticipated such a drop in temperature. Although they had accumulated quite a number of furs, not all of them had been processed as those that had been used to make leather and their current clothing. On the morning of the second day of the storm, when the temperature had dropped another notch, Lu Yin had finally woken up with a cold sweat on her face. Her gaze was tormented and shifted intermittently between sadness and anger before finally settling on a stiff, constipated expression. Restless, the young woman had shakingly searched for her brother's reassuring face. But Sarah had long since tossed his head outside to avoid reeking of the room. Lu Yifeng's skull had long since rolled down the hill, and after a night of being smashed by hailstones, it was questionable whether it still existed in a single piece. Lu Yin had taken a long time to acclimatize and come to her senses, but when she had at last figured out where she was and was still alive, her hatred had flared up instantly. Never acting without a plan, she had inspected her status to plan her next strategy, and when she had seen the ether stored in her bracelet, she had been left petrified with indignation. Ether storage, 0 points. Bob bastard. I'm going to kill you. She screamed inside, filled with an irrepressible rage when she saw that all her belongings had been taken from her. Even the rudimentary wooden spear she had carved for herself was no longer at her side. If she did not take immediate revenge, she would be unable to look at herself in the mirror. She had never experienced such a feeling of shame and powerlessness. Usually, everything always went perfectly as she had planned. It was only after meeting Jake that her life had turned into a nightmare. And now her brother was dead because of her. She knew that he had just failed the second ordeal, but the sight of his decapitated head was deeply traumatic. Realizing that the fire was almost out and the residents were still asleep, she had immediately set out to carry out what she thought was a legitimate revenge. Like a predator on the prowl, she had tiptoed to Tim's axe and then searched every room in the house for that bastard of Jake. After several minutes of extraordinary tension where she didn't even dare to breathe for fear of waking someone up, she had to face the facts. Her target was not in the house. She could have deployed her spirit body to make sure, but it was a risk she couldn't take, as this action would have alerted those nearby who had awakened their 7th stat. In the first ordeal it was extremely rare, but she had very quickly realized that in this second ordeal it was far too common. All those who had survived to the 3rd trial were tough motherfuckers with resilient minds. Unlocking the extrasensory perception was nothing special anymore. She had been about to steal clothes, weapons, and food before she ran away when a dry voice had startled her. "What are you doing? You weren't planning to leave, were you?" Sarah had mocked in a sarcastic tone as she sat under her stack of fur. For a moment Lu Yin had flinched, not knowing what to say, but realizing that Jake was not there, she had soon regained her arrogance. After all, she has the Myrmidian bloodline too. "That's exactly what I was planning to do," she had finally replied by bulging her chest and raising her chin in a defiant manner. But contrary to the hostile reaction she was expecting, the young blonde woman opposite had just chuckled and looked at her as if she was looking at someone with brain damage. "You want to leave? Please do," Sarah had said, showing her the door with her hand. Lu Yin could hardly believe it, but she hadn't hesitated for a second. This opportunity may not come again once Jake returned. Always decisive, she had hastily walked to the heavy wooden door and lifted the latch to open it. She could hear from the wind and the pounding noise that the storm was not over, but she had been confident that she could survive alone for a while with the clothes she had stolen and her telekinesis. Huge mistake. No sooner had she opened the door than an icy cold had seeped in, her hand on the edge of the door almost instantly freezing. With horror, she had withdrew her hand, smothering a curse of pain, and closed the door without a second thought. No doubt, she was trapped in that stone house until the storm was over. Once this sad reality had been accepted, Lu Yin became much more docile. She soon discovered that Sarah and Tim were not the only occupants, and that a little girl, a bear and its cub, had also occupied the house. When Kevin had learnt that she thought he and the Zewood were related, he had almost dismembered her on the spot. It was only because he was afraid of Jake's reaction that he had refrained from doing so. Soon after, Tim and the Zewood had also woken up, unexpectedly feeling fine, although Tim was a little pale. Clearly Tim's Baskirian bloodline had done its healing work, or perhaps he was just lucky. After all, it was his specialty. Sadly, Lily had not been so lucky. By the third day, she still hadn't regained consciousness, and Tim had become terribly depressed, never leaving her side for more than a few seconds. Lu Yin had gotten used to this lockdown and got along almost well with Sarah and Kevin, who had no prejudices about her. She had almost forgotten her revenge, but unconsciously she feared Jake's return. What was bound to happen happened. On the third night, Jake opened his eyes underground a few feet below the fireplace, and a mental scan was performed to determine the condition of his body and the residents above him. Feeling the intrusive mental wave, Lu Yin, Sarah, and Kevin had briefly stiffened, but for Lu Yin it had been a time of terror and despair. The others might not have been able to tell the difference, but having the Eltarian bloodline too, the spirit was her specialty. When Jake's spirit body had passed through her, she had known right away that she would never get her revenge, and that recovering the stolen ether would forever remain an illusory dream. The next second, the stone floor had begun to swirl like a vortex as it disassembled to make way for a Jake stronger than ever. His golden and silver irises had directly fallen on her, and no words had been needed for her to understand the warning. This was her last chance. And for her brother who had died for nothing, she chose to not waste this last chance. She wavered for a long time over whether to attack Jake or not, hoping that in a moment of inattention she would manage to surprise him. But when she had seen his stern and cold face, she had eventually given up. Good choice, Jake just said while patting her shoulder before going to Lily's bedside. For Lu Yin, it was a huge relief, comparable to how an innocent man might feel when he is acquitted of a crime he did not commit. But before she could completely relax, Jake's voice echoed mentally in her mind one last time. Don't think it's over, though. I haven't forgotten that you brought an alien here. Without it, Lily wouldn't be in this state. You'll have to compensate her if she wakes up. What? Lu Yin almost fainted from sheer outrage. With what am I supposed to compensate her? You've already taken all my ether. Chapter 277 Aftermaths of the Storm. Lu Yin may have felt repressed inside, but there was nothing she could do about it. Jake was just too strong as things stood. After harumphing as hard as she could, the only way she had left to cope with this tyrant, she had to resign herself to searching for a way to acquire more ether as soon as possible. Luckily, she found it a lot easier than she expected. The next day, on the fourth stormy day, it finally came to an end. The hailstones stopped raining and the sky cleared in less than an hour, replaced in a snap by a cloudless azure blue sky. The sun was hitting hard, and the chirping of birds and other pterosaurs made a deafening din. It was nearly unbelievable that just a few moments earlier an ice storm was raging. Nevertheless, none of the participants would be able to forget the devastation of the ice storm so easily. The storm had left indelible marks, which were not only environmental. Of the 6,000 or so players still in the running, more than 3,000 had been eradicated during those 4 days. 2 other Nosks in the top 50 had been eliminated, reducing their number to 5. The sudden cold had been catastrophic for this species. One of the Krish in the top 5 had also disappeared from the ranking, replaced by an individual named Aleph Smith, a human name, possibly from Earth. This participant who came out of nowhere had about the same number of points as the eliminated Krish, as well as a kill to his credit, which left little doubt regarding the course of events. The Krish had been killed. For Tim and Sarah, it was shocking news. The boy still remembered the nightmarish chase like it was yesterday, and he could hardly believe that such a Krish had been eliminated so suddenly. Unlike the Nosks, there were no other Krish participating in this ordeal outside of the 3 in the top 5. In other words, the murdered Krish had a 1 in 3 chance of being the one who chased them, and a 100% chance of being one of the 3 Krishes Tim had met in another refuge area. Since the leader was significantly larger than the others and ranked second in the ranking, the probability that the Krish who had chased them was actually killed was actually 1 chance in 2. With the temperatures having returned to normal, Jake, Sarah, and Tim immediately resumed their routine as if nothing had happened with a few minor exceptions. Indeed, after the misadventures of the previous days, Jake had decided to reinforce the defenses of their shelter even more, even if it meant paying a steep price. Naturally, he had no intention of being the only one to get his hands on it, and he had asked for a contribution in ether as rent to each resident. Sarah and Tim had readily donated 50,000 points of ether to help him strengthen and sharpen the various objects, blades and needles that made up the traps. The new door had also been forged from a whole rock this time, and had been infused with gray ether as well. Gray ether had its limits, though. A blunt or completely smooth tool could not become miraculously sharp. On the other hand, this sharpening ether could make the slightest asperity as sharp as a razor blade. Jake and Sarah believed that even a perfectly round and soft object could become sharp with enough gray ether, but this was unverifiable, since inorganic matter suffered from the same 100-point etheric limit. Still, they had been able to take advantage of this property to make each stone and weapon extremely solid, without rendering them unnecessarily sharp if that was not their primary function. Jake was also able to verify a question that had been on his mind for a long time. A point of gray ether normally cost 5 points of raw ether. Whether it was the big door, his machete, or a tiny needle, the cost had never changed. 500 ether points for 100 gray ether points. By cutting rocks of different sizes, Jake was finally able to confirm that there was a limit to this. Above 3 cubic meters, the price doubled. Above 6 cubic meters, the price tripled. To put it simply, 1 ether point was needed to enchant a 3 cubic meter unit of volume, and this was also true for stats. A giant needed much more ether than a dwarf, but those who barely exceeded a certain size/volume were the biggest losers. Because of 1 extra cubic centimeter, improving their ether stats would cost them a lot more. As such, it was better not to put on extra weight. All the more reason to become an etherist as soon as possible. A good etherist could easily calibrate the encoding to avoid waste. Since a human didn't even occupy 1 cubic meter of volume, it might be possible to improve their stats at a much lower cost. Fortunately, this was not a problem for Jake or Sarah. All they had to do was defeat worthy opponents. It took them a whole day to improve their defenses. Kevin and Lu Yin helped a little, but the Ziwid was clearly too stupid to perform any task requiring more than 2 brain cells. Jake was already happy that he wasn't shitting directly on the tile floor of the house. The next day, Jake upgraded their equipment. As long as the corresponding pieces of armor were polished perfectly, injecting gray ether to make them stronger wasn't an issue. After his fight against the Nosk, he had realized that a high-quality armor could really make the difference. Even using all his abilities, the alien's armor had pretty much taken the brunt of it, with only his reinforced machete being able to chip it. Until now, Jake hadn't met any other participant with this gray ether in their arsenal. Deslail's gift had proven to be far more valuable than he had originally imagined. There were certainly other people out there with similar advantages, but it was clearly not commonplace. Seeing the results of his forging attempts, everyone willingly paid the ether required to upgrade their equipment. Lu Yin was sweating profusely when she had approached Jake to make her a sword like Sarah's, but surprisingly he had agreed without batting an eyelid. He had made one for her willingly, as if he wasn't afraid of being attacked in his sleep. And indeed he wasn't. Jake would always meditate and sleep underground, a few meters under the chimney. There was nothing she could do to threaten his life without him noticing. Also able to use telekinesis, she could control the needles and traps hidden in the ceiling and walls, but her abilities paled greatly in comparison to Jake's. Despite the group's apparent willingness to cooperate, they barely talked to each other. Jake was as antisocial as ever, perhaps even more so since the arrival of Kevin and Lu Yan. His silence and sternness was largely responsible for the heavy tension within the group. The only one who dared to joke and flirt from time to time was Kevin, who had since reverted to his human appearance. "Sarah, how about you and me going for a walk under the moonlight one evening? Lu Yan, you can obviously tag along." While the group was hunting off the base, Kevin was giving it his best shot. Seeing that the young lady wasn't upset by his constant teasing, he had quickly gained confidence, pushing the bar higher and higher. Walking closer and closer to the blonde to the point of touching her regularly, his ribs had already been pricked several times with the tip of her sword, but that had not been enough to make him give up. "Sure, but there are no moons on this planet. You might have to wait a long time." Sarah eventually giggled in response. He and Kyle would have gotten along well. "Shut up." Jake barked a few meters in front as he was struggling against an Orcsan python with a paralyzing and soporific venom. Seriously, while he was fighting for his life, this dumbass of a cousin was flirting with the two women of the group. Plus, it was clear that Sarah seemed to let him do it on purpose. She could have turned him off a long time ago, but she was allowing him to carry on with his old-fashioned seduction game, as if she was trying to get him jealous. "Fuck, if you think I'm going to take the bait that easily, you're dreaming, baby," Jake mumbled between his teeth, not forgetting to gut the snake flailing in front of him. At least Tim was trustworthy. Lily was still unconscious, so he was redoubling his efforts at his side. Lu Yan was the rear guard of their group and was vigilant, but her mistrust of Jake had naturally led her to Kevin. This muscular and hairy idiot wasn't quite her style at all, but he would make a good meat shield in case of trouble. Jake could see through Lu Yan's tricks as well, but he was amused by them. Although Kevin may seem like an idiot, he was a true Wilderth to the core. He may have been arrogant, smug, flirtatious, and moody, but he was nonetheless a gifted man who had once been a genius trader. Chapter 278, Familiar Footprints. In the end, the day's hunt ended without a hitch under the persistent flirting of his cousin Kevin trying in vain to seduce the two ladies. After having felled the snake, Jake had resolutely used it as a whip on his cousin to let off some steam. Even in human form, he could endure quite the beating. Nevertheless, Lu Yan's excellent observational skills were to be commended. She never failed to notice Jake's mood swings and would always get away in time to avoid being targeted unnecessarily. Sarah also knew when to stop and offer a helping hand. Only his cousin didn't seem to be able to, or maybe he was doing it on purpose. It didn't matter. Beating up his cousin was also salutary for Jake, and granting his dear cousin's wish was not at all a concern for him. Of course, no wound was really disabling or lasting, and he was careful never to forget his surroundings in case of an enemy ambush. For the next 2 weeks, the group carried on training, hunting, exploring the island, or fulfilling challenges. Lily had also come out of her coma, but as Jake feared, she had not escaped unscathed. The left side of her face as well as her entire arm was paralyzed. No matter how many days passed after her waking dream, it made no difference. Combined with the news that her father Daniel had been eliminated from the ordeal, the little girl had broken down in tears, and Tim had volunteered to console her, eventually reaping a couple of slaps. Jake had no comforting words for her, as he only knew this uncle by reputation. To heal Lily, Kevin had offered to bite her. His Werbear bloodline allowed him to form his own pack by infecting other humans with his bite, and they would share a fraction of their ether and body stats with him thanks to his alpha status. Tragically, Lily vehemently refused, preferring to remain, in her words, crippled for life, rather than look like a hideous, hairy monster. The girl's resolute tone was so full of sincerity that it had the effect of an arrow on Kevin, piercing his ego right through his heart. It had taken a few days for him to recover, and the silence that had ensued had been a great boon to all of them, especially Jake. Regardless, everyone had quickly come to terms with Lily's paralysis, the stupidity of the Zwid and Kevin's cheap jokes. After a few days hunting together and the base consolidated, they had been able to start hunting and exploring separately to accomplish the feats and quests of their choice. To avoid unpleasant surprises, Jake had required that Lu Yan stay with him at all times. She had naturally been reluctant, but burying her in the bedrock for a few hours had been enough to change her mind. At that very moment, approximately 15 days after the storm, Jake and Lu Yin were exploring an unexplored section of the island together. It had been about 2 days since they had left the camp, and they were now more than 500 kilometers far from their base. Such a distance was not so easy to cover, even with their stats, because of the treacherous environment and the predators swarming in this jungle. To get here, they had to spill tons of blood, massacring their way to where they were. Right now, in front of a frowning Jake and a sweaty Lu Yin stood a mountain, or rather a volcano. And this volcano was active. After performing all sorts of auxiliary exploits and killing many monsters that had rewarded him with an additional 1,000,000 ether points, he had concluded that this was not enough for him. 200,000 additional points were from Lu Yin. His ether stats were currently as follows. Oracle rank 5, Sergeant, 15, 43M/100M, ether storage, 3,159,386 points. Ether status. Strength, S 202.6 points. Agility, A 199.6 points. Constitution, C 186 points. Vitality, V 188 points. Intelligence, I 216.3 points. Perception, P 214.2 points. Extrasensory perception, EP 212.4 points. Since he had passed the 180-point mark, his progress had begun to decelerate until slowing to a crawl. Small carnivores, sea monsters, and other mammals were no longer demanding any effort from him, and this was reflected in the improvement of his stats. Without challenge or difficulty, his Murtharian bloodline could not be stimulated. Apart from finding stronger opponents or slaughtering thousands of creatures to gain an extra ether stat point, there was not much else he could do. Only his mental stats were still being challenged thanks to his constant vigilance, the creation of his ether core, and the study of the manuals on ether and the genetics of the mirror universe. Even after 2 weeks, he was far from fully understanding these 2 books. They had practically been memorized by rote, but deriving concrete applications from them was not so simple, if not impossible for the moment. Concerning the ether, for example, the primordial etheric rune was the point. By abruptly condensing a large ether mass, it was possible to create an etheric singularity causing physically observable effects on the real world. A kind of energy spark at the base of all ether skills and spells. To his knowledge, all spells, be it his telekinesis or the fireballs of the 2 sisters, started with such a rune, but the process was automated thanks to the corresponding etheric code. If he could create this single rune, he would no longer be so helpless. This was also the method used to create an ether core. Instead of creating a fugitive spark of energy, the ether had to be compressed more and more stably until there was enough ether to generate an etheric gravity field. He had been trying to create his ether core for almost a month now, and he was very close to the goal. Although he wasn't successful yet, these efforts had many directly observable benefits. His spirit body had reached level 6, and his mental ether stats had continued to progress decently despite the stagnation of his physical stats. His telekinesis was stronger than ever, and with the assistance of the Green Soul Stone, he was able to generate a protective force field around him almost permanently. If he came across the Nosp from 2 weeks ago in a similar storm, he was confident that he would be able to endure the alien's killing intent without faltering, and then behead him along with his armor in 2 or 3 blows. Further killing of weak monsters was useless and inefficient with his current ether stats, but not so with his body stats, since they have hardly changed since the beginning of the ordeal and were not originally so high. If he could improve them just a little, his fighting strength would increase substantially. This was the reason he had undertaken this journey and the reason he was standing in front of this volcano. He wanted to temper his body the Cantharian way. Since the Cantharians lived on a volcanic telluric planet very close to their star, he needed a similar environment to stimulate that bloodline. And for that, what better than an active volcano? Alas, this volcano was not so easy to climb. It occupied a vast space at the edge of the snowy mountain range in the center of the island. Regularly, lava jets were ejected from its crater, and all traces of vegetation for kilometers around had long since been charred. The air was polluted and smoke-laden, while the temperatures were unbearable, which explained the abundant perspiration dripping from Lu Yan's body. If Jake hadn't forced her to come, she would never have set foot on this part of the island. Besides, there were no players in the area apart from them. Walking for the first time on the ash surrounding the volcano, Jake paused for a while. There were deep footprints in the charred ground in front of them, and they were eerily familiar to him. If his memory did not deceive him, they were the same as those of the humanoid monster with obsidian skin that he had met during his second trial. Since he had arrived on the real island, he had never encountered such a monster again. Only Tim had once encountered such a creature when he had had to flee his first hideout, but this one was considerably smaller. On the real island, these monsters seemed to be quite rare. He is not alone, Lu Yan commented with some trepidation in her voice. Seeing Jake's worried expression, she was glad to have him by her side for once. Ignoring the young woman's remark, Jake set off towards the volcano again, but with more caution. Spreading his spirit body out over a radius of about 30 meters so that no movement would escape him, he began to levitate a few centimeters off the ground to muffle the sound of his footsteps. Lu Yan did the same, but it demanded much more effort. A few minutes was her limit. 15 minutes later, Jake stopped again and discovered new footprints, but this time his face was livid. Lu Yan, who couldn't stand the silence, couldn't help but exclaim telepathically, "This one is much bigger. Do we really have to take all these precautions?" "We must," Jake replied seriously, catching her almost off guard. It was rare that he addressed her without contempt. "What is the risk compared to the Nosk of 2 weeks ago?" She worried when she saw that this tyrannical antisocial was willing to talk. "The one I met during the second trial was about 10 meters high, and I only passed that trial by stealing the green soul stone from his neck. In a fair fight, I would certainly have died in a few seconds. It was by ambushing him and fleeing underground that I managed to steal the stone from him. Based on the footprints in front of us, this one is 20 meters high at the very least. Except in case of miracles, I don't think any players on this island have the slightest chance." Chapter 279, Ancient Civilization. I don't want to alarm you, but given the number of footprints, this creature is not alone," Lu Yan stammered, stating the obvious with a worried face. This time Jake ignored her whining, too busy thinking about the implications of such a presence around the volcano. To his knowledge, there was only one volcano on the island, but he had only explored about a third of it. Over the past 2 weeks, their group had accomplished quite a few exploration feats, including the discovery of several archaeological sites with rudimentary burial chambers, as well as archaic ruins of ancient cities, but they had not been able to extract any useful information from these discoveries. Whether the tombs, alien bones, and remains of utensils and buildings they had found, they were in such a dilapidated state that these finds were at least several thousand years old, perhaps even millions of years old. In fact, the few intact bones and artifacts were much more recent than the local ruins, and according to Jake, they were probably participants like him from previous ordeals. The builders of these ancient cities were nowhere to be found. Even the graves were empty, but according to their past observations, this island had surely been the seat of an advanced civilization. The few relatively intact ruins they had found were not made of rock, granite, marble, or wood, nor were they decorated or covered with precious metals such as gold and silver or primitive alloys such as bronze. Everything pointed towards the fact that the former inhabitants of this island had a more advanced technology than that of the Earth, but even such a civilization had not survived the test of time. Jake didn't know what may have caused their extinction, but based on the synopsis of the second ordeal, he had a good idea of what people they were. According to the initial information, the asteroid where this ordeal took place had been an ancient outpost belonging to the Zorian race. If the system A0 housed the oldest planets in the mirror universe, this people must have been quite impressive at its peak. Unfortunately, none of these ruins gave any indication of their appearance or culture, and he had almost forgotten that the descendants of the Zorians were supposed to have found refuge in the sanctuary bubble where they were. Could it be that these humanoid creatures were in fact Zorians? After all, they were the only intelligent life form on the island he had encountered so far. Even if the one he had encountered was from a simulation, the fact that it had been able to craft or procure a pendant indicated that its intelligence had surpassed that of an animal. Although he had spent several weeks on the island, Jake still hadn't managed to mine a single green soul stone. Either the Naquat ores were too small, mixing with the soil and plants of the island, or the latter were huge monolithic blocks like the one covering the ocean floor or those buried under the safe haven clearings. Green soul stones of exploitable size seemed extremely rare, and as rough as its soul stone could be, there were signs of being cut by an unknown tool. Should I take the risk of going back up this trail? Jake was seriously tempted, but he gave up on the idea. He hadn't come here for that, and he was unable to trade a single blow against what he thought was a 20-meter-tall Zorian anyway. Too bad I didn't scan it with my bracelet last time. That would have answered my doubts. Jake didn't start spending his ether more generously until the third trial. Before that, he considered that he could just die and start over again indefinitely, and would only spend his ether when he felt he had no choice or when he could not find any other solution. With the beginning of the third trial, his outlook had changed, as his death would become final and would mean the failure of his second ordeal. He had also gained a significant amount of ether and had come to accept the idea that the ether in his bracelet existed only to be spent. Since then, he had squandered an astronomical amount of ether over the past few weeks, scanning every animal, plant, and material he encountered, allowing him to gain an almost encyclopedic knowledge of most of the elements that made up the island's ecosystem. In any case, they had had no choice, since the feats of herbalist, biologist, cartographer, and geologist required a complete identification of the relevant components. Memorizing the appearance of a plant or animal was not enough. It was also necessary to know their properties and characteristics. Unless a considerable amount of time was wasted personally testing each plant and material on the island to become familiar with their characteristics, scanning them was the best solution. The information provided by the scan was limited, but it was considered as a pass by the counter of these exploration feats. Jake initially thought that these feats would be fairly easy, but by not receiving any notification indicating that the chains of feats to be unlocked had reached their final stage, he had begun to hold high expectations for the final reward. It would be neat if it could be another soul glyph. After receiving the first two, he was craving for more. Having decided to stick to his original plan, Jake barked a "let's go" in a sullen tone, and then he started climbing the volcano again, leaving behind him a dubious Lu Yen. They could have reached the summit in a few minutes, but after finding these footprints, Jake had slowed down the pace so as not to miss any of them. Luckily, he seemed to have worried for nothing. After the previous footsteps, the duo encountered no hiccups and arrived safely at the edge of the crater at the top of the volcano. The volcano was not so high, a little more than 1,000 meters, but its crater was worthy of respect, spanning over 5 kilometers. The mountain being active, Jake was ready to disappear underground with Lu Yen at the slightest sign of eruption. Carefully, with Lu Yen sweating profusely behind him and coughing regularly from the smoke, Jake leaned over the crater to see if his plan was feasible. A volcanic chamber filled with a sea of lava greeted his sight, a warmth comparable to the hot air escaping from an oven ventilating his face. Jake, I know you hate me, but I can't follow you inside. Lu Yen stuttered again before finally declaring in a firm and resolute tone. What's the point of playing coy or frightened if in the end she was forced to commit suicide in a sea of lava? Jake frowned when he heard her complaint, but when he saw her reddened skin and sweat-soaked clothes molding the curves of her body, he had to face the facts. She couldn't follow him where he was going. Nevertheless, he did not trust her enough to leave her alone either. It was indisputable. Over the past 2 weeks, Lu Yen had also accumulated quite a bit of ether and had largely regained the ether that Jake had stolen from her. She had even, as Jake had demanded, given half of her earnings to Lily. To be honest, collecting ether by cooperating with Jake and his companions had been much easier than when she was traveling with her brother. It hurt her heart to lose all her hard-earned ether to a stupid, immature kid, but she knew it was either that or die. If Louis Feng had been there, that idiot would surely have given his ether instead, but he was not. It was the first time she had to fend for herself without him. Same deal as the previous one. Jake finally made up his mind as he raised his index finger in the air and revealed a row of fangs. I'll give you a chance to go about your business, but if I find out that you conspired against me or the rest of the group, I'll kill you immediately, and not just in this ordeal. If you have any common sense, you know that my oracle rank will surpass yours after this ordeal, no matter what you try. That means I'll be able to locate you with a single thought once you're on B842. He had thought of forcing her to sign a slave contract, but it was not in his nature, and he knew that the young woman was too proud for that, or she would not have reached the third trial. The only thing that might compel her to accept was if he threatened to kill her brother for real, but again it was not in his nature to commit such despicable acts. "I promise I will behave myself," Lu Yin promised with a submissive smile devoid of malice. Inside, however, she was seething with rage at this seemingly endless chronic humiliation. Jake nodded before leaning over the crater rim again as if he wanted to check something. As she thought he was about to jump, he turned around and gave a final instruction. "Go back to the foot of the volcano where we entered and inform me if any players or the owners of those footprints come back. Make sure you don't go too far away from this place so that I can find you easily." "All right." Following these words, Jake made a matched jump into the volcanic chamber, and for a brief moment the young woman thought he had slipped and committed suicide. Leaning in turn close to the rim, she discovered that he had actually found support against the inner surface of the crater and began to scale down the volcano, slowly moving closer to the sea of lava below. Chapter 280 Body Tempering. Once in the volcano, Jake immediately ceased to care about the existence of Lu Yin. She had been warned. If she still decided to betray them after that, it meant that she was ready to pay the consequences, but with his understanding of the young woman, he strongly doubted it. After falling a few dozen meters along the inner wall of the volcanic chamber, Jake had quickly grabbed the first bump to prevent his body from speeding up excessively. Like a caffeine-fueled jumping spider, he then began to descend the volcano in a series of incredibly skillful somersaults. Once he had scaled down several hundred meters, the suffocating heat coming from the lava fumes in the heart of the volcano began to be felt, and he had to slow down his progress. A feeling of pleasant warmth was caressing his skin, and he knew that the temperature in the room had already exceeded 100 C°. In an ordeal world with an ether density of 40, this was absolutely not to be underestimated. On Earth, such a heat would have been the equivalent of 400 degrees Celsius. To be exact, the summer temperatures on the island would have been lethal to a normal human if the ether level of the weakest participants had not been raised to the same level as the ether density for the sake of fairness. With an ether constitution of about 100 points, a human player could endure temperatures close to 100 degrees Celsius on this island. But Lu Yin was already sweating as they were climbing the volcano. With their agility and intelligence improving their body control, it was relatively simple to control their sweat glands to sweat at will. That's why he knew that Lu Yin had been faking her exhaustion by pretending not to be able to stand the heat. She could easily have followed him in the volcanic chamber to his current position. But beyond that, he was confident that none of his companions could follow him. With every meter bringing him closer to the lava sea, the temperature would increase by a notch, and it did not take long for the temperature to approach 200 degrees Celsius. With such heat, no human would be able to venture out here with impunity, and those who could would soon become dehydrated before gradually being cooked. At this temperature, the scorching, oxygen-depleted air surrounding him was beginning to threaten him. His skin became moist, and he soon started sweating profusely. A little more, and he would reach a depth suitable for tempering his body. Almost there, Jake exclaimed as he gazed down at the lava lake a few dozen meters below him. His body had begun to glow like a lump of metal immersed in flames, and the veins and arteries under his skin were already fully apparent, like rivers of lava crisscrossing the surface of his body. Even without doing anything and despite the overwhelming feeling of asphyxiating heat, Jake could feel how his cells were absorbing this heat and transforming it into another form that could be used in an unknown way. His Cantharian bloodline was at work. If he just stayed stuck to the wall of the volcano where he was, hanging a few dozen meters above the lava, he knew that his body would gradually strengthen until the heat was no longer a challenge for him. But that would take a considerable amount of time, and that was not what he wanted. Heat and radiation were just two of the ingredients needed to truly nourish his Mertharian body. He also needed rich, nourishing soil to support his body. The lava would have been perfect for this, as it was literally molten rock and soil, but unfortunately, it was too hot for him. If he came within a meter of it, he was sure to finish roasted in a matter of seconds. Besides, the reason why he did not dare to descend to less than 20 meters was not due to the heat of the air, but because the lava lake was periodically ejecting geysers of molten rock, as if the volcano could not help but release a big fart from time to time. "I think this is the ideal depth to start at," she commented in a placid tone, corroborating his own intentions. Lately she spoke little, but she was not idle nonetheless. When Jake was training, she was the one monitoring his surroundings through the feedback from his spirit body and bracelet. This was one of the reasons why Lu Yin had no chance to catch him off guard. Talking about the Oracle Ace seemed to be a taboo subject among evolvers, but with the information he had gleaned here and there, Jake had come to realize that not all Ace were necessarily kind or friendly. These consciousnesses provided by the Oracle system generally matched the personalities of their hosts, but that didn't mean that they felt any attachment or compassion for them. Many simply answered their host's questions about the Oracle system and nothing more. As such, Jake was lucky with she. Her personality was relatively empathetic, and she was really trying to help him. Maybe it was subconsciously what he was looking for, a trustworthy person, and her behavior was just the result of a program. But for now, it didn't matter. Listening to She's instructions, Jake began to drill a tunnel in the rock wall against which he was leaning. Unlike the soft earth of the jungle, the rock was too hard for him to control it by force, but it was still a mineral material of which he could perceive and affect the ether. With the help of his sword and by thermally agitating the nearby rocks to raise their temperature, he soon cut himself a cave of about 1 cubic meter. This was just enough for him to squat in there, but it was more than sufficient to keep him safe from untimely lava splashes. From there, Jake started digging down with his sword and his earth manipulation skill, and little by little, he got closer to the lava lake. By the time he was only a few meters away from the lava lake, the rock tunnel he had dug had become as hot as an oven, and the stone in the walls was glowing slightly red without him needing to transmit energy to it. Knowing that he was unable to advance any further, Jake stopped digging and began pounding with the pommel of his machete and his free fist the rocks he had excavated to prepare the soil in which he intended to bury himself. As his body was feeding on these ores, the minerals had to be small enough to be assimilated. After that, all that would be left for him to do was to start a long meditative nap. The process of crumbling the burning rock took a few hours, and by the time he finished the task, Jake's skin and lips were so dry that he was already regretting his idea. The real question was not whether he could train here, but whether it would be possible for him to survive at this depth for more than a few hours without water. Once buried, the Cantharian's accelerated physical growth skill should become active and your water consumption should be drastically reduced. She explained calmly. A few days should not be a problem. In the worst case, you can always go back up to the surface to replenish your supplies. Right. Jake nodded with an enlightened face. He and Lu Yin had indeed crossed a stream before arriving at the base of the volcano. The slight doubts and nervousness he felt dissipated after hearing the speech of his Oracle AI, and he recovered his usual composure. Inhaling deeply, he buried his body in the earth and closed his eyes with a resolute expression. It was a bet on the future. Soon, his body covered with scorching gravel began to develop a kind of fever, and his mind turned cloudy, quickly leaving him in an altered state of consciousness. Instinctively, he activated his accelerated healing skill, and the pores of his charred skin opened up to let in more heat and nutrients. The first few hours were excruciating, but at a certain point in time the pain subsided, giving way to a revitalizing trance-like sensation. The body tempering was working. Time passed slowly, and as he was growing accustomed to this training method, Jake suddenly noticed that the heat was no longer so unbearable and that a kind of warm air draft was running regularly over his skin, sending shivers down his spine. Confused, he opened his eyes, and as he saw the tunnel around him, he almost got a fright. What happened? Jake asked without moving, knowing that she never slept. The rock in this volcano seems to fit perfectly with your Mertharian's genes. Your body assimilated all these minerals without any difficulty. Even without She's report, Jake could see for himself that the soil covering him had disappeared. His body hadn't changed visually, but his veins weren't glowing as much. The tunnel also looked a little narrower, but that was probably just an impression. Having no idea what time it was in that cave, he was even more shocked when he heard his AI's answer. You have been unconscious for 3 days. If you hadn't tried so hard to dig that tunnel, you might have stayed awake, but you were apparently suffering from some kind of heat stroke after working so hard in such an environment. You have been feverish during the whole process. Not feeling particularly different from before, he took a look at his body status, and his eyes widened abruptly when he saw the familiar notification. What the heck? Chapter 281 Discovery. Body status. Physics. Murtharian body, LVL1. Height, 2.11 meters. Weight, 135 kilograms. Strength, 68.3 points. Agility, 60.5 points. Constitution, 87.2 points. Vitality, 84.6 points. Intelligence, 36.4 points. Perception, 31.6 points. NB, average human stats, 5 points. His strength, agility, constitution, and vitality had increased by about 50%, and even more in the case of the last two. His intelligence and perception had also increased slightly, even if it was derisory compared to his physical stats. In 3 days, such a progression was mind-blowing. Since combined with the multiplier coefficient from his ether stats, his effective fighting strength had actually increased by more than 50%. Currently, even at equivalent amounts of ether, his body was about 4 to 6 times stronger than that of a world-class human athlete of the same height. Speaking of his height, he was beginning to freak out seriously. Being over 2 meters tall had already shocked him when he became a Murtharian, but this height, although rare on Earth, was not abnormal. In 3 days, he had gained another 8 centimeters, and it was beginning to become worrisome. Although he would have no trouble being selected for a basketball team, he sincerely hoped that his second growth spurt would come to an end soon, because at this rate, he was afraid he wouldn't be able to walk through the doors anytime soon. While this could be worrisome, Jake had long noticed that this was a general trend, observable in virtually all evolvers. Sarah herself, who was about 1.7 meters tall when he first met her, was now over 1.8 meters tall. In fact, even Tim was quite tall for a child of 10 or 11. Seeing how his body was transformed during those 3 days, Jake was earnestly tempted to dig down a little closer to the lava lake and then bury himself again for another indefinite period of time. But he knew he could not afford to do so without making sure his companions were well. Any important news to mention that would have taken place during these 3 days, Jake lazily asked his trusty Oracle AI in the tone of someone asking his secretary to make him some coffee. Sigh? Nothing serious, but something has indeed happened. Essia, one of the 2 pink-haired sisters, has been eliminated. Jake stiffened slightly when he heard the news. Before this ordeal began, he thought that the 2 noble women would have been weeded out in a matter of minutes. But when he discovered their names in the player ranking and the fact that they had not tried to find them, he had come to believe that they were doing very well on their own. Who would have thought that the younger sister would be eliminated while he was sleeping? Musing over the news a bit more, Jake shook his head with a fatalistic attitude. It was too late to rescue them. Since Enya was still alive and hadn't tried to contact them, it meant that she was either out of trouble or unable to get to them. With his shadow guide, he checked the direction in which the young woman was heading and was able to confirm that she had not joined Sarah and the others. As for Will, he was still on his own somewhere in the middle of the island. I find it hard to believe that Will hasn't tried to contact us all this time. Jake was amazed at the score of the businessman, who was in 72nd place. He was exactly 20 places behind Jake and 16 places ahead of Sarah. In his group, only Jake and Kevin were in front of him. He was supposed to be the weakest in their group with Tim. However, to be honest, no one in Jake's group had a ranking below 200. With their teamwork and the reduction in the number of players still vying, their ranking was slowly but steadily rising. Right now, there were less than 2,000 candidates left, and the killings between players had begun to dwindle. Either the small fry had been eradicated, or the remaining survivors were much more cautious and had formed their own groups. During this brief moment of reflection, she had started to offer some semblance of an answer. There are plenty of ways to survive on this island without resorting to violence. Like Tim with his luck, he may be using a skill of his own to survive and thrive on this island. Since his first ordeal was focused on his eloquence and management skills, his special rewards should have been derived from these past experiences. Or perhaps he's made some dependable allies. Jake shrugged. I seem to remember that he was awarded the Ether of Charisma, but I can't imagine what use that would have here. At least I couldn't even tell the difference. I couldn't even tell the difference. Can it work on the monsters on this island? Probably. Just because his stats were insufficient and he didn't try to influence you doesn't mean that this stat is useless. After he got his share of the sale of the rank 7 digester, that's surely not the case anymore. Like the gray ether, the charisma ether uses the intrinsic qualities of individuals to make them even more dazzling. On a truly ugly and socially inept man or woman, the effect would be extremely limited. On the other hand, on a beautiful and eloquent man or woman, a simple smile can have unexpected effects. Jake remained silent for a few seconds, his eyebrows frowning intensely, and then he said in a hesitant tone, "Should I visit him then? I'm curious now." "You'd better check what Lu Yin and the others are doing beforehand," she replied adamantly. Jake sighed as he levitated to the entrance of the rock tunnel he had excavated. He dreamed of being able to roam around this island without worrying about anything or anyone. But unfortunately, if he did not check the situation of Lu Yin and the others, he would not be at ease. However, just as he was about to stick his head out of the entrance of his artificial cave to levitate to the top of the volcano, a rustle, followed by moderately high-pitched and guttural sounds, but still intelligible, petrified him on the spot. Suddenly retracting his head and his spirit body, he lay down on the rocky ground and stopped breathing to conceal his presence. Seeing that the voices had not changed tones and that they were moving away from his position, he relaxed, and only after the volcano became silent again did he dare to take another breath. What was it? It sounded like Oraclean, but with a strong accent. Jake wondered with uncertainty. "I don't think they were participants. Those voices sounded familiar to me," she answered after a long time. "Familiar?" Jake repeated, stroking his 5-day stubble. The last time he shaved was before his expedition with Lu Yin. Considering that she was just the tampered consciousness of an overpowerful evolver, it had to be something important for his IA to remember it after her memories were repressed by the Oracle. "I'm sure of it. I recognize those intonations. Just follow them, and when I see the way they look, it should come back to me." "All right." Jake hovered out of the tunnel in search of the owners of these voices, but he found nothing inside the volcano but the lava lake below him and the rocky walls of the crater. Confused and unsure of what to do next, he flew to the top of the crater, but found no evidence of the recent passage of any other life except his own and Lu Yan's footprints, which had not faded away yet. In order not to draw attention to himself this time, he didn't set foot on the ground once as he descended the volcano, but scanned the ground surface around him with his spirit body for clues. When he had descended about halfway down the mountain, he found the giant tracks of the humanoid monsters from the second trial, and upon inspecting them again, he was caught by a detail. Why did these traces stop here? The footprints disappeared in the jungle, but they emerged exactly where he was, as if these monsters had spawned here by magic. Intrigued, he directed his extrasensory perception to the ground beneath these footprints and the nearby rocky elevation, and unsurprisingly discovered an underground entrance and a secret passageway. He could see in his mind that an archaic mechanical system was holding a huge boulder in front of a gallery dug into the volcano. Where the footprints were located, a system of ropes and gears and a precise demarcation at ground level indicated that it was a freight elevator. In other words, there was a secret entrance dug into the side of the mountain and an elevator just in front of it. By extending his senses to their limits, Jake realized that both passages were seeping into the depths of the volcano. No wonder those creatures didn't notice me. They were walking through an adjacent tunnel. Jake realized with some disbelief at such a discovery. Could this be the base of the Zorians? As if to confirm his suspicions, a system notification popped up in his mind at that very moment. Side quest enabled. You have discovered a mysterious secret passage belonging to a native civilization. Find out where it leads and uncover its secrets. Chapter 282 Lu Yan's Style. Jake was dying to explore these underground galleries on his own, but he gave up this futile desire. He would have plenty of time to explore the hidden side of the volcano after checking out his companion's circumstances. Moreover, such an endeavor required some preparation, not to mention the fact that he was relatively dehydrated after his 3-day nap. Slightly dazzled by the bright sun shining high above him, Jake believed he had nothing to fear from these seemingly humanoid monsters for the time being. If reality was not too different from the simulation, these creatures were vulnerable to sunlight. During the day, he had virtually nothing to fear, so it made sense that they would mostly move underground, shielded from any sunlight. This did not prevent him from levitating to the bottom of the volcano as quietly as he could. He even took the opportunity to erase the traces of their previous passage, including their footprints at the top of the mountain. He lost a few minutes making a round trip, but it was only after this action that he was able to relax. He didn't know if these monsters were aware of their presence, but unless they had specifically checked the top of the volcano, it was unlikely. As long as they were unaware of his presence, he could go back to the volcanic chamber without any worry. He had also not forgotten to close the entrance of his artificial cave to avoid the slightest suspicion. Under the guidance of his shadow guide, Jake disappeared underground as soon as he reached the reassuring edge of the jungle. It wasn't that he didn't want to do the same when he climbed down the volcano, but unfortunately, it was mostly rock. Moving underground would have been too laborious. He did notice, however, that while his ether stats had not increased at all during the last 3 days due to his blackout, his control of earth and heat had improved slightly. This method of cultivation seemed to have a beneficial effect on the Cantharian part of his bloodline. After a few minutes of traveling underground, Jake clenched his fists in irritation when he realized that Lu Yin had strayed far from the area where they were supposed to meet. If she thought she could betray them so easily, she was far too naive. Champing at the bit, Jake sped up noticeably to catch up with her, but moments later he realized that he had overreacted. His prejudices towards the young Chinese woman were turning him paranoid, but he would rather do that than get knifed in the back without figuring out why. Sweeping the area with his spirit body, he realized that Lu Yin was standing right above him, and from her ether flow, she was seriously injured. What happened? Jake asked rudely as he stepped out of the ground. Lu Yin was having trouble breathing. Her back was wedged against a tree and her legs were tucked up against her chest. When she saw his head sticking out of the ground, she almost had a heart attack. His low, deep voice was already fueling her most recent nightmares, and seeing him in this context had terrified her to the core. Seeing that the young woman had chosen to be quiet and stood motionless and crouched in spite of her injuries, he could not help but scowl with disdain. "You don't answer me?" Jake scolded in a threatening tone, staring her straight in the eyes. But contrary to what he had imagined, the disturbed young woman pounced on him like a hare flushed out and pressed her pale little hand against his mouth to prevent him from speaking. "Shush! Shut up, or you'll get us both killed," Lu Yin whispered, making the shush sign with her mouth and her free hand. Jake was dying to grab the hand on his mouth and crush her 5 fingers, but he refrained from doing so, recognizing all the clinical signs of genuine fear. The young woman seemed more expressive in his presence since her true nature had come to light, but the fear and deference she displayed in his presence was usually feigned. Jake raised his eyebrows instead, but instead of listening to her, he expanded his spirit body to its maximum range. When he arrived, he had already scanned the place with his senses and hadn't noticed anything. Besides, with the exception of a few players, monsters, and possibly those mysterious Zorians, Jake didn't fear much on that island. On land, he was confident that he could easily escape from any foe. Paying close attention to his perception feedback, he found no life forms nearby except for some small orcsin-like insects, reptiles, and birds, most of which were immersed in their usual lethargic naps at this time of day. These creatures were venomous, with blood whose blue blood cells were loaded with orxanium. Their venom and their fluids in general were soporific and hallucinogenic, but as long as he didn't bother them, he didn't have much to fear during the day. It was at night that the hells were unleashed on the island. Grabbing Lu Yan's wrist, he unscrupulously pushed her hand aside, preventing him from speaking, and then took the opportunity to dust himself off. His leather armor and the gray ether-reinforced plates covering it had withstood the high temperatures of the volcanic chamber, but his growth spurt made him feel cramped inside. This was also one of the reasons why he wanted to return to his base camp. "There's nobody here but us," Jake calmly said when he saw that the young woman still hadn't cooled down and was about to flee with her poorly healed wounds. At the sight of his composure and serene tone, Lu Yan's face fluctuated briefly, but she visibly relaxed after that. With a groan of pain unworthy of a lady, she let herself slide down again against the tree that was previously supporting her. Jake was then able to observe the young woman's wounds in more detail. The only reason she was still alive was because of the armor he had crafted for her. The chest plate, forged from molten rock and reinforced with ether, was slightly cracked, but this had saved her from an otherwise deadly impact. Regrettably, her chest underneath had not fared as well. With the swelling due to inflammation and internal bleeding, her chest size had gained 2 cups, but in this particular context it was anything but a source of rejoicing. Her sternum had caved in like Jake's a few weeks earlier, and she had quite a few broken ribs. It was amazing that she had survived this long, but her injuries were not as severe as Jake's. At least her lungs hadn't suffered too much. It was the pressure that was keeping her from breathing properly. She also had some scratch-like lacerations, but these were on the mend. What happened? Jake repeated again, now that the young woman had restored her typical poise. Too busy controlling her telekinesis and her ether of vitality and constitution to speed her healing, the young woman barely heard him. Nevertheless, she forced herself to respond succinctly between grunts of pain. Not participants. They were monsters from the island, but different. Sort of monkeys about my size with long claws and a red crystal inserted in their foreheads. Instead of being in a berserk state like the other red-blooded flint-type animals, they had an excellent sense of cooperation, and they chased me away, tirelessly ignoring all the other dinosaurs on their way. I was only able to lose them by leading them to another participant walking around. Jake's face twitched when he heard the strategy used to shake off the monsters. Sacrificing an innocent player to ensure her own survival was definitely her style. He had no doubt that she would do the same with him if it was the only way to escape death. Except that she could be sure that in such a situation, he would not hesitate to do the same with her. Indeed, finding another participant nearby was not difficult. All one had to do was wish it, and an oracle path would immediately be calculated to show the way. As such, it was a last resort solution that he could also count on if he was overwhelmed by an enemy tide. After all, there were only 100 tickets in the Phantom Sanctuary of the 4th trial. Chapter 283, Bad Feeling. You mentioned a red crystal embedded in their foreheads, right? Jake reacted by recalling his own experience during the 2nd trial. Paradoxically, the first dinosaur he had met during the simulation of the 2nd trial also had a red crystal inserted between his eyes, but once on the real island, he hadn't met a single one. There were T-Rexes and other monsters of comparable size and strength, but none of them had a crystal. He had come to question whether this fortuitous encounter during the 2nd trial was not a coincidence, but rather a scenario planned by the simulation to expose them to certain clues. Scanning the crystal had indeed taught him some crucial information about the 3 special ores composing the object, and that could be found everywhere on the island. In fact, it was the same with the humanoid giant with its black and hairless skin. He had been exposed to this monster very early during the 2nd trial simulation, but it had taken almost a month on the real island before finding other traces of their existence. They were indeed red crystals, about the size of a quail's egg. Lu Yin confirmed as she took a short break to forget the pain. I killed 2 of these monkeys, but each time one of their fellow monkeys had recovered the crystals before I could extract them from their bodies. So I don't know much about this other than what the Oracle scan report told me. Jake's eyes lit up. Placing his bracelet against her own, he downloaded the data from the scan, as well as a video clip of Lu Yan's fight against the creatures without asking permission. But Lu Yan didn't dare to hide anything for her own sake this time. She accepted the request for the information transfer without hesitation. If Jake could discover something, she had everything to gain from this. So, she asked with little hope when she saw his deadpan face. I think it's already clear that this crystal protects the spirit of these monsters from the influence of the various soul stones. The red color and their multiplied strength at night suggest that they were under the influence of the flintium ore, which I think is a red soul stone. But the fact that they didn't lose their minds and collaborated so ingeniously suggests that there are other factors at play. What I'm certain of, though, is that these monkeys were controlled or obeyed someone or something. In spite of their apparent cooperation, these animals seemed devoid of emotions, and their reaction time and attack pattern always remained the same, as if they were driven by their reflex or some kind of program. I thought the same thing at first. Lu Yin agreed with a nod, but I couldn't find any sign that they were obeying anyone. It is true, however, that I felt repeatedly observed, as if no matter where I was hiding, I could not escape that invisible gaze. This better explained why Lu Yin was so agitated when he found her. When all our hiding places were discovered in an instant and an invisible presence was constantly spying on us, we could quickly become paranoid. Even after she had lost her pursuers, she had not been able to regain her composure. The serious injuries she suffered had accentuated this anguish. It happened last night. Jake asked more to confirm than out of doubt. Yes, why? No reason. Let's go back to the base. I have something to share with everyone. Lu Yin was curious, but she knew when to shut up. This time Jake helped her to speed up the healing process. With his telekinesis and increased reserves of vitality ether, stabilizing the young woman's injuries took only a minute or two, since she had already done most of the work. The duo then set off again, covering the distance to the hillside where their base of operations was hidden in less than a day. The only reason it had taken them more than 2 days to get to the volcano the first time was because they were unfamiliar with this section of the island and had proceeded with extreme caution. Jake had found Lu Yin around noon, and they reached the bottom of the hill at dawn. Traveling at night had been particularly grueling, as the island's animals were mostly active and generally in a berserk state. To reach their base, they had lost count of the number of dinosaurs and monsters of all kinds whose blood they had shed. They even had to flee several times. Traveling at night was dangerous for Lu Yin because she didn't have a green soul stone like Jake. Contrary to the experience of the second trial, surviving one night in the jungle was not impossible if prior exposure to Naquat had been sufficient. On the other hand, the young woman had no trouble finding these safe havens, since she knew exactly what to look for. If that failed, covering herself with local mud, as Sarah and Tim had done before, was another viable solution. In order not to waste time, she had to stay almost stuck to Jake for most of the trip, creating a suffocating and uncomfortable atmosphere between the two individuals. This was even more of a burden for Lu Yin, who could feel that Jake was even more unfathomable than before. Why don't you share your training method with me? Lu Yin was constantly complaining in her mind, feeling deeply stifled inside. Of course, even if Jake wanted to help her, there was nothing he could do, and he had no desire to do so. To be fair, there was a method at his disposal to assist his companions. Blood donation. By giving a little of his blood to each member of his group, especially those without conflicting bloodlines like Lily, Sarah, Lu Yin, and potentially Tim, he could bestow some of his abilities on them. By temporarily granting them the self-encoding skill, he could effectively help them to overcome their ether limit. Their anatomy being different, their bodies would not be altered, and it was obvious that the effect of his ether skills would only be a fraction of his true abilities. But at least it would give them an extra trump card. The real reason Jake didn't do it was not because he didn't trust them, but because giving enough blood with an etheric code loaded with energy could weaken his bloodline in the long run. His Murtharian bloodline was still only LVL1 despite his best efforts. The corresponding etheric code was gradually strengthening, but it was painfully slow. In order not to lose this precious ether every time he was injured, the bloodline ether fueling this etheric code was usually concentrated in the most important stem cells and tissues of his body, such as bone marrow, for example. If he concentrated this very special energy in his blood and then donated it, he would indeed be weakened. At his level of ether control, he had no way to replenish this lost energy. To be even more accurate, the same was true with his ether of vitality or constitution. If he concentrated all of his vitality ether in his blood and then extracted it and donated it, the vitality ether trapped inside would indeed be lost. Except that unlike his bloodline, this type of ether could passively regenerate itself via the surrounding ether until it regained its previous value. This was the opposite of the bloodline ether, which in order to accumulate required to stimulate and nourish its bloodline by respecting a certain number of principles. Perhaps it would eventually recover, even without any active effort on his part, but he was certain that it would be a long process. Even in the case of an important loss of ether of vitality or constitution, it might take several days or weeks depending on the case to be regenerated. This was also one of the reasons he was so eager to create his ether core. The pure energy inside could effectively supplement his ether stats after a few adjustments. The conclusion was that Jake would only be willing to donate blood when his regenerative abilities became such that it wouldn't make the slightest difference. Until then, he would do better to preserve his vital energy for life and death situations. Back on the hill, Jake and Lu Yin braked abruptly as they smelled human blood near the clearing. With their current perception stats, their sense of smell was not much different from that of a hunting dog. Straining their ears, no suspicious noise came from the clearing, but considering that the sun was not yet fully up, this was not surprising. Perhaps they had simply been attacked by wild animals, Jake thought fleetingly. But deep down he had a bad feeling. Chapter 2, 84 more guests. Sprinting with a few jumps to the clearing, he noticed that most of the traps had been triggered. Lu Yin was following him closely, but her self-preservation instincts had already caused her to fall slightly behind. Jake expected to find a devastated clearing with potentially a ruined house and signs of confrontation, but what greeted him instead was a peaceful clearing and an untouched stone house. The greenish shimmering due to the Naquat deposit below was starting to fade with sunrise, and there was no hint of a deadly fight. Quelling his doubts, he sank underground and reappeared under the tile floor of the house. He then spread out his spirit body to scan the etheric signatures present, but the feedback he received made him shudder. There were way too many people. Jake was agitated at the time, barely holding on to barge into the house and slaughter everyone. But as he paid more attention to the etheric signatures, he recognized those of Sarah, Kevin, Tim, and Lily. Even the little bear like Ziwid was doing well. Knowing that his mental scan had alerted most of the people present, he stopped hiding and materialized without further ado in the middle of the central room. No sooner had he pulled his body off the floor than a huge, hairy, clawed palm monopolized his field of vision. Casually tilting his head to the right with a cold harumph, he grabbed the culprit's wrist and sent him flying over him in an Aikido style by using his momentum. "Kevin, what the hell are you doing?" Jake yelled in a bad mood. "Damn it. Attacking the landlord without any scruples. As a squatter, don't you have any honor?" Recognizing this deep, annoyed voice, Kevin, who was about to resume the attack, momentarily stiffened. "Jake? Who else?" Jake replied curtly. At that precise moment, Lu Yin timidly knocked on the door and then entered after having lifted the latch with her telekinesis. Her body language, her worried expression, and the dribble of sweat on her forehead could almost make it look like she had rushed to join the fight and assist him, but Jake would be a complete moron if he fell for it. The simple act of knocking on the door had already ruined the entire show. Obviously, it was intentional. Lu Yin knew full well that Jake could see through her acting, and she hadn't dared to smash the door to bring credibility to her play. Knocking on the door was therefore her way of taking responsibility for her act, even though nothing prevented her from keeping up appearances with the rest of the group. Faced with this commotion, the rest of the people present woke up one by one or stopped what they were doing before that. Moments later, the sun was up and everyone had gathered in the clearing to introduce themselves, allowing Jake to put a name to the new occupants. Two young women sharing the same chestnut brown hair and intense green eyes were staring at him with an embarrassed expression. They were wearing leather armor that was a little too large for them, which Jake remembered having made for Sarah and Lu Yin 2 weeks earlier. Who knew in what outfit they were wandering the island before settling here? Probably as naked as Tim and Sarah during their reunion. These two women were none other than two of his cousins, the resplendent, neo-feminist Noemi and Kate. They were usually the type who refused to depend on anyone and to succeed at everything on the first try, so their presence here was indeed a valid reason for their embarrassment. Jake also noticed a new bear cub arriving on his thigh. Its long, glossy white hair, hanging tongue, and round, shirt-button eyes were vaguely reminiscent of a humanoid poodle. Another Ziwid for sure, and once again, not the sharpest knife in the drawer. Unless all the Ziwids were stupid? Finally, a middle-aged man wearing his own gear was also present. His leather armor was roughly sewn, but considering that not everyone could magically forge needles like Jake, it was pretty good work. This man had brown hair and the same green irises as Noemi and Kate. It was another of his uncles, Elijah. It was hard to tell with the Ziwid poodle, but these three members of his family had pale, bloodless faces, and much of their exposed skin was covered with bandages. Clearly, they had been injured recently. "What are you doing here, and why were the traps on the hill triggered?" Jake asked with his arms folded without showing any sign of accepting or rejecting their presence. "Cough. How about we talk inside?" Elijah proposed in a somewhat uncomfortable tone. The temperature had started to drop again last night, and it was quite chilly in the clearing this morning. It could be a harbinger of another storm, but for the moment there were no black clouds floating above them. They still had some time ahead of them. Sure. Jake nodded before returning inside the stone house. During the 6 days or so of absence, the living room hadn't changed much, but several fur mattresses had taken up space to accommodate the new guests. Sarah, Tim, Lily, Kevin, and Lu Yan had their own room thanks to Jake's powers and their own efforts, but the rest of his family and the second Ziwid had to share the center room. Because of this, the living room was relatively cluttered and reeked of Ziwid's wet hair, whose hygiene seemed very poor. The brown Ziwid that Lily had tamed was always close to her and was far cleaner. Jake sometimes wondered how such an intellectually limited race could have ended up mixed with humans and all sorts of humanoid aliens, each more dangerous than the other. It was a fact, however, that these two Ziwids, despite their innocence and harmlessness, had survived until now without suffering the slightest visible injury. Jake had also spotted numerous animal prints around the hill resembling those of the rabid hyenas he had encountered during his second ordeal. They seemed to patrol the area frequently, and their feces were all over the place, but he had not spotted any. At first, he had thought the base had been raided by a pack of these creatures, but this was apparently not the case. Once everyone was inside, he repeated his previous question, and Elijah proceeded to explain the details of what had happened, not forgetting to sigh between each sentence. I ran into George and Bryce. They're fine. His uncle changed his words and finally began his speech with what he thought was good news. Bad choice. A vein of irritation immediately pulsed on Jake's forehead. He couldn't care less about these two assholes. Just because he tolerated Kevin's presence didn't mean he cared about them. Seeing Jake's expression darken, Elijah, as a good corporate CEO, instantly realized that he had just made a mistake. Clearing his throat to mask his blunder, he then went straight to the heart of the matter. Your cousins Arthur, Aurelie, and Edward were eliminated after we were attacked. Noemi, Kate, and I had no choice but to come here after George and Bryce refused to help us. These two have an oracle rank too high for us and refuse to be located, even by us. So we had to rely on you. Elijah paused briefly to gauge Jake's reaction to the news of his family's elimination, but only an expressionless face responded to him. Clearly, Jake wasn't caring much more about their life either. Sighing again, he resumed his speech. When I arrived on this island, I teamed up as soon as I could with Arthur and Aurelie. Edward, Noemi, and Kate joined us much more recently, about 3 days before we were attacked. The attack of our camp took place about 2 days ago. They were players or native island creatures? Jake interrupted him briefly. The attack happened at night, so it's hard to tell, but it didn't look like a player's attack. Elijah squinted his eyes in a focusing effort, as if he wanted to remember all the details of the scene, but couldn't visualize them clearly. They were essentially large flint dinosaurs, in their typical nocturnal berserk state from their red blood and the surrounding flintium. Normally, as long as we hide well, they ignore us and continue to kill each other. Except that this time, they seem to have only us in their sight. Our camp was besieged from everywhere at once, and we had to abandon the camp. Arthur and Aurelie were never cut out for a marathon. Do you have any idea how much they hate sports? I don't. Jake responded with indifference. If they were that unwilling to exercise, they would never have made it to the third trial. The first trial was already a sure way to turn the worst sedentary person into a great swimmer in no time and a real test of physical and mental endurance. Chapter 285, The Ominous Presence. Sigh? Anyway, it was dark and the jungle was treacherous. Aurelie got her foot stuck in a root, and a Spinosaurus devoured her in one bite. Arthur lost his temper and tried to avenge her. It turned out that she hadn't stumbled accidentally. The root was an Orcsan rattlesnake, and he in turn was bitten in the leg. Another monster devoured it shortly afterwards. Jake and Lu Yan found it hard to believe that participants who had survived to the third trial could make such basic mistakes, but apparently that was indeed the case. Nevertheless, they could not help but think that something was wrong. We spent the rest of the night running away until morning. With the sunrise, those monsters left us alone, and we were finally able to catch our breath. We reached your base last night, but those same monsters had followed us. Thanks to all the traps, Kevin and Sarah managed to repel them. Unfortunately, most of Kevin's minions died to protect us. Kevin's minions? Jake turned to his cousin with a questioning, arched eyebrow. His intense gaze literally meant, "What are you waiting for to explain this?" However, his cousin was almost as thick-skinned as him. Running his nose with total relaxation, he shrugged his shoulders with a small laugh. "Nothing to feel sorry for. After you left, I decided to see if my bear bloodline worked on the local species. It turned out it did. By challenging a few weakened hyenas and bears at dawn, I managed to subdue them. They are mentally connected to me, and I can share their thoughts. The footprints around the hill are simply my betas patrolling around the camp." "How many did you have, and how many do you have left?" Jake inquired to estimate the magnitude of last night's confrontation. "I had tamed 33 of them. I only have 4 left. Some of them seem to have been ripped out of my control by a foreign entity." Considering that Kevin and Sarah had participated in the fight personally, it was a relatively large monster attack. Jake was having a hard time understanding what could have brought so many different species together to pursue his uncle and 2 of his cousins relentlessly. Thinking about his own discovery and the attack that Lu Yin had also recently suffered, he unhesitatingly raised the question that was burning his lips. Did those monsters have a red crystal embedded in their foreheads? This time it was Sarah who answered, knowing exactly what he was referring to. "Not just red, but blue as well. I'm also sure I saw a green crystal in the dark," she explained concisely in a grave voice. At that moment, not only Jake, but Lu Yin also had trouble believing it was a coincidence. As a precaution, Jake checked the player ranking with some foreboding, and when he saw the current ranking, an expression of horror could not help but warp his traits. When he had started his nap in the volcanic chamber 3 days earlier, there were still more or less 2,000 participants in contention. When he woke up, the number had dropped below 1,900, but nothing alarming. However, between his reunion with Lu Yin and his return to the base, the number of players had dropped below 1,700. It was crucial to remember that the most reckless and incompetent participants had long since been eliminated. At this point, only seasoned, overly meticulous, and tough-minded players were left. "Take a look at the player ranking. There's something going on," Jake croaked solemnly. Following his word, all opened the player ranking page, and soon after a horrified expression creeped onto their faces too. At that point, no one still thought it was a coincidence. Even the 2 Zewids seemed nervous. "It's going to happen again," Elijah sighed prophetically. "Of course it's going to happen again, Sherlock. The real question is, what do we do to prepare for it?" Kate snorted without showing any respect for her older uncle. "There's not much we can do about it." Jake cut the debate short with a flashy hand gesture. "It's been 45 days since the second ordeal began. We don't know when the Phantom Sanctuary will appear, but it's normal for the ordeal to become more difficult as time passes. No matter what happens, our score is already guaranteed to be in the top 0.0001% of the participants. We can only do our best at this point." True. Noemi, who had remained silent until now, showed her assent. No matter what the ordeal had in store for them, they just had to face whatever the sanctuary bubble would throw to their faces. "We could also rejoin other participants, couldn't we?" Tim timidly suggested with a raised hand. His other hand tightly clasped Lily's hand. Clearly, his seduction skills were superior to Kevin's, who was still blue-balled after all his attempts. To get stabbed in the back by a Krish or a Nosk? No way. Sarah shook her head with pursed lips. You only had to look at the player ranking to see that the aliens of these 2 species were wannabe psychopaths. These 2 species were responsible for 90% of the kills between players. Trying to cooperate with these aliens was a whim almost tantamount to committing suicide. It just amounted to choosing another executioner. Lu Yin, who avoided sticking her or in Jake's presence, re-centered the discussion on the attack that Elijah and his 2 cousins had suffered to his utter surprise. Did you also feel a presence while you were running away? As if no matter what you were doing or hiding, something or someone was watching you, and there was nothing you could do about it. Now that you mention it, even Kevin, who hadn't paid as much heed to detail since he got his Werbear bloodline, started scratching his beard with a pensive face before looking back suddenly. If I tell you that I didn't sleep a wink all night because I felt like I was being watched, would you believe it? His hairy cousin grumbled as he inspected the space behind him, but apart from the wall there was nothing special to observe. You too, Sarah exclaimed with a shocked expression. I thought I was the only one. It turned out that everyone without exception except Jake and the Zewids had felt this presence. Tim, who could sense the danger from quite a distance, was even more receptive to this kind of thing and couldn't close his eyes without having horrible nightmares. "Do you have nightmares too?" Jake asked the others with a puzzled face. "No, I don't. I couldn't sleep, so no." "I do." It was Lily who raised her hand. Basically, either they were not sleeping or they managed to fall asleep and a nightmare ensued, waking them up immediately. In addition to the injuries sustained during the attacks, this could explain the dark circles and pale face of his uncle and his two cousins. According to Kevin and Sarah, this ubiquitous feeling had only kicked in after last night's attacks ended. "Should I stay here?" Jake pondered inwardly with genuine frustration. Originally, he didn't plan to stay here. He still had a volcano to explore and a training session to complete. Unfortunately, it was clear that the group was facing a major threat without him. However, it was also true that he could not give up his own training and adventures. Stagnation in this ordeal was like walking backwards. In the end, Jake decided to tell them about his own experience under the volcano and his theory about the Zorian descendants and the fact that they could be responsible for the attacks. No one was really shocked by this revelation, believing that it was much more logical for these wild creatures to be under someone's control. The fact that the presence observing them was untraceable meant that the culprits could make themselves invisible or had an unstoppable means of evading their sight. Jake had the highest extrasensory perception and the most developed spirit body in the group, followed by Lu Yin and Sarah. Lu Yan's ether stats were capped at 100 points, but her spirit body was stronger than normal thanks to the Eltarian part of her bloodline, which she had obtained in a way he was not yet sure about. Well, Sarah also had the self-encoding skill, and her ether stats were actually very close to Jake's. Since she had never specifically sought to form an ether core, her mental stats were lower, but still close to 150 points. Jake had not detected any hidden presence underground when he arrived, but his range was limited to about 20-30 meters. A little more if he was focusing his consciousness in a specific direction. Nevertheless, one had to consider the possibility that they had a way to escape his senses. In this case, these aliens could very well stand a few meters below him without him noticing. As for the rest of the group, their ether stats were maxed out and their spirit body had reached level 2 or 3 after the first trial, but their abilities were clearly a notch below. Kevin was the most limited in terms of supernatural perception. He had a very compact spirit body with a beastly aura, but hardly extensible. This meant that the range of his extrasensory perception was even more reduced compared to that of a normal human, but he compensated with an increased perception of his physical senses. His sense of smell, hearing, and sight was better than Jake's, even taking into account his Mertherian body. Concluding that it was too risky to leave his companions alone for too long, Jake decided to temporarily put his initial plan on hold. At the very least, he would make sure to be back at the base before nightfall. Chapter 286: Exploring the Abyss Again. Luckily, the sun had just started, and he decided to take care of the feats in progress he had overlooked when he experienced firsthand the incredible efficiency of the volcano body tempering method. He didn't have so many options anyway. He still had his goals of hunting in the ocean, the feat of free diving, as well as the exploration of the ocean depths, plus perhaps trying his luck once more against the invincible monster that had nearly killed him on his last dive. The only catch was that even with his recent progress, he was skeptical about defeating such a creature. The good thing about his group, however, was that with the exception of the two children, all of them refused to stay cooped up in the clearing. As a result, Jake's agenda was accepted without a hitch, and he went on a solo mop after repairing the traps and reinforcing the weapons of his uncle and two cousins with his gray ether. Elijah used a sword made from the bones of a local species, while Noemi and Kate wielded a rudimentary spear similar to the one previously used by Lu Yin. After hinting that they preferred to use a sword, Jake forged the weapons they wanted and then hurried off before they had time to solicit him to build them a bedroom or sew armor for them. The beach was not far away, and moving underground without any dead weight with him made it easy for him to travel such a distance. In less than 10 minutes he had left the jungle and was now wading in the white sand. The sun was not yet high in the sky, but there was enough clarity. This time, he did not throw himself directly into the water as he was used to. but decided to play it safe. He hadn't forgotten his free-diving goal, but he didn't need to dive to reach the ocean floor. He also didn't want to ruin his armor and clothes, so he quickly undressed before burying his equipment several meters deep to avoid unpleasant surprises. If his stuff was stolen, he could only blame it on bad luck. Nonetheless, he still kept his trusty machete. Like a ghost, he then disappeared under the sand again and went a little deeper underground towards the ocean. The dry sand quickly became wet and then soggy. At first, he thought that moving underground into the ocean would be easy, but it turned out to be more complicated than he had expected. The waterlogged sand and earth meant that he was not fully in an earthy environment. There was a lot of water around and above him over which he did not have the same control, and his progress was affected accordingly. This was not enough to stop him, though, and by assisting his earth manipulation skill with his telekinesis and his own swimming talents, he managed to move forward unhindered. Using his spirit body as a sonar, he deployed his consciousness outwardly in the form of brief impulses to avoid drawing attention to himself. He suspected that this was one of the methods potentially used by the mysterious presence his group had felt to monitor their movements. Theoretically, if the action was performed quickly enough, it would overwhelm their perceptual abilities and they would not be aware of anything. Conversely, to get feedback from his spirit body, a simple nanosecond was enough, since his bracelet recorded everything. She could easily retrieve this information. Alas, Jake was far from being able to emit such short-lived mental waves, but to fool poorly alert sea monsters with limited intelligence was enough. Little by little, he felt the pressure of the water above him increasing, and progressing became more and more tedious, until he felt the slope tilt down sharply like a cliff edge. Following the curve of the sand, his body made a 90-degree turn and he sank into the abyss. In a few minutes, he noticed that the water pressure had already exceeded the pressure of the time he had touched the bottom of the ocean during his first trial. This meant that the depth where he was now was at least over 1,000 meters. His Murtharian body could withstand abnormally high pressures compared to other species of equivalent physiology and stats, but this ability was not invincible, or Jake would have long since become invulnerable. His skin stiffened like the surface of a drum, but that was far from enough. His anatomy was adapted to moving underground, but at a depth limited to a few dozen meters maximum and without direct contact with the earth above him. What he was doing at the moment was extremely dangerous and pushed his body to its limits. Jake kept going for a few more minutes until he reached a point where he felt it would be dangerous to continue. He had a good amount of breath, but it was best to avoid taking any undue risks. If he ran out of air here, he would die pitifully with only his own stupidity to blame. He waited a few more seconds for a notification to validate his achievement, but to no avail. He even checked the exploration and feats section to see if any changes had taken place, but there were no changes. Remembering that he had to validate his feat by proving that it was not a suicidal attempt, he made the decision to turn back. And great good it did him, because climbing the cliff again by swimming underground proved to be one of the most grueling hardships he had faced since the beginning of this ordeal. Between the pressure of the water, the weight of the sand, and the increasing lack of oxygen, the Jake who reappeared on the shore had little more bearing than a worn-out salmon after swimming against the current of his birth fjord. Jake wheezed and panted for a long time after dropping in the sand on his back like a starfish, but the notification he was waiting for still made him smile. Explorer of the Abyss, Gold 2488/5000M. 1000 PTS of ether rewarded. This feat is a prerequisite for another achievement. With this first success, Jake resumed at once after catching his breath. He knew that it was impossible for him to reach the 5,000 meters depth area, but he could try to accomplish the corresponding hunting and freediving feats. There were all kinds of abyssal creatures, each one more hideous and puzzling than the next, and there were many opportunities for such feats. He had, of course, inspected in more detail the enormous green soul stone covering the ocean floor, but it had turned out to be too massive to be of any use. The energy it contained was colossal, but he had no way to harness it. Even after all this time, he had no clue how to mine it. Securing the feat of freediving for 100 and 500 meters, meanwhile, required no special effort on his part, and he did not come across any marine predators capable of threatening his existence. These depths could not be considered part of the abyss, and he was still close enough to the shore to be able to react in case of a surprise attack. Then, instead of directly attempting the feat of freediving for 1,000 meters, he first preferred to hunt everything he could in the spot where he intended to do his freediving. To do so, he first returned to the island and moved underground to reach the relevant location. This allowed him to keep enough breath to face the abyssal species, while allowing him to escape quickly if the monster boss of the last time decided to show up. Unlike species swarming on the surface, monsters at this depth were not always intimidated by the daunting aura emanating from his apex ocean predator title. Most of them were too bizarre to be intimidated so easily, and the fact that his human skin reflected too much light compared to the local species made him particularly striking. Among the abyssal species, there were generally two predominant types: those that emitted light to bait their prey or to orientate themselves, and those whose skin absorbed so much light that they became invisible. Many species were blind at these depths where darkness reigned supreme, but for those that were not, any light was something captivating and vital to their existence. Soon a curious fish resembling a long translucent eel began to snake around and tried to bite it. Then its companions of various shapes and forms tried their luck in turn. A moment later, Jake was slaying monster after monster in complete darkness, seeing the counter of several hunting feats climbing at a staggering speed. Chapter 287: New Soul Glyph. Sadly, he couldn't say the same with his ether stats. This small fry was barely able to pierce his hard leathery skin, while these hunting sessions were too short because of his limited breathing capacity. It took the whole morning plus part of the afternoon for Jake to manage to eliminate all threats from the dive spot, he had decided. The murky water of the area had long been tinged with red, but the currents were dispersing the blood to the four winds, preventing predators too curious to identify where it came from. In any case, when a sea monster that was too curious approached this area, it was immediately wiped out. On several occasions, Jake felt the presence of a gigantic creature swimming not far from him. The sea currents generated heckling him without being able to do anything about it. But he never saw the culprit monster head-on. He would be lying if he hadn't thought about the boss of the abyss from the other time. But the fact that he hadn't been attacked and the fact that the monster had left as it had come brought an end to his dread. Not seeing it anymore after a while, he had directly executed his 1,000-meter freedive. A few minutes later, Jake touched the ocean floor, and after a few more minutes, he was back on the surface. With jubilation, Jake saw the familiar notification popping up in his mind, and the least he could say was that it was worth the effort. Extreme Diver. Gold. Your skin can tense up like the skin of a drum to withstand considerable pressure, and your skin can passively extract a fraction of the surrounding oxygen, drastically improving your underwater endurance. Only works in fluid. The next moment, a huge ether glyph measuring his size descended from the sky to settle in the air in front of him. Then a flash of light enveloped him, and he felt the soul glyph merge with his mind and the other two glyphs. I did it! Jake screamed inwardly, clenching his fists to contain his excitement. He had been less and less optimistic about receiving a new soul glyph after the abyss exploration feat had given him nothing, but he had been proven wrong to his utmost delight. The new title did not improve his fighting skills in any way, but it gave him an extra layer of protection to deal with a hostile environment that was still dangerous for him. Jake felt that completing the free-diving feat was impossible for most participants without a specific bloodline or strength far exceeding that expected from a second ordeal. However, this did not mean that there were no means to cheat. Let's imagine that a player had built himself a submarine or a bathyscaphe. Going down to the bottom of the ocean would have been no challenge. Of course, one would have to wonder where to find a submarine on the island. But he had a vague intuition that this island was full of opportunities for every type of individual. Maybe it could be by taming another animal or designing a diving suit reinforced with constitution ether, etc. There were plenty of possibilities. Jake had just picked the one that was the most challenging. The sun was already starting to go down, and a cold wind had started to blow over the water. The day was far from over, but he decided to go back to the island. He would test this new glyph the next day. He dug up his clothes, put his clothes back on, and returned to the base. With the exception of Kevin, everyone was already back, but his cousin eventually showed up in time, just before nightfall. His body was covered with blood, but it wasn't his. Nothing to report? Jake asked routinely, with little concern for the answer. No, except for the white Zwid who cried his eyes out when he was forced to take a bath. The smell was just too awful. Ugh, whatever. If it was the most notable event of the day, he hadn't missed a thing. Tired, he rinsed himself with normal water and then isolated himself in his room as usual to work on his ether core. Sarah, Kevin, Tim and Lily were used to his quirks and made no comments. But Noemi and Kate harumphed coldly when they found that he didn't even greet them when he came home. Who does he think he is? Noemi grumbled as she discarded the fur that Sarah had given her to scrub on the floor. It wasn't for the fun of exploiting them that Sarah had given them that task, but because everyone in that clearing, Lu Yin and Kevin included, had learned to make their own clothes. Relying on Jake to renew their wardrobe was impossible. Not having enough furs cleaned and scraped for all the beds, Sarah had shown them how to deal with the many furs piling up in the basement. By dint of hunting everything that moved, they had accumulated a large stock of furs, skins, and bones. Shut up, Kate murmured as she continued to vigorously scrape the inside of the fur with her bone knife. We're already lucky they accepted us. We'll soon find out tonight if it was worth it. You're right. Night fell, the wind blew and temperatures dropped, but the sky remained clear, devoid of clouds. The storm they feared had not occurred. The group dined silently by the fire in anticipation of another attack, but nothing happened either. They had nightmares for those who dozed off instead, and Jake could finally see how nervous everyone was, as if they were constantly being spied on and scared of something. Although he looked in the same direction as them every time they turned around, all he could find every time was the silence and the cold rock of the building's walls. Tired of all the waiting, Jake went back to his room to practice, and the night went by without any noticeable events occurring. When he left his room the next day to return to the beach to finish his hunting challenges, he came across a group of zombies with sunken cheeks and protruding eyeballs. What the hell? Jake cursed as he reflexively drew his machete until he realized they were his comrades. His shout of surprise did not provoke any reaction, as if they were too tired to hear it, and he had to give them all a flick to get them out of their torpor. When they recognized him, their confusion subsided considerably, but they were still very numb. What's wrong again? Still those nightmares, and that feeling of being spied on. Yes, and it gets worse. Kevin grunted as he crunched into a roasted dinosaur leg from the night before. He was the only one who still had energy left, but he was clearly less talkative than they were used to. Jake heaved a long, exasperated sigh, had breakfast with them, and left without further conversation. He had no idea what was happening to them. He didn't doubt their experience, but why was he the only one to whom nothing was happening? Perhaps he was too strong, and the culprit was afraid of him? Yeah, probably. What do you think, she? He asked his AI to sound out her opinion. The bit I remember reminds me of the Zorians. I seem to remember that mental attacks are one of their specialties. I don't remember anything more. Oh, I should have guessed with all those different colored soul stones. Thank you, she. Let me know if anything comes back to you. No problem, she promised before returning to her silence. Jake then went back to the beach, and like the day before, he undressed before burying his clothes. As he was about to burrow underground to hunt in the ocean depths, a rustling of leaves behind his back alerted him, and after a few seconds, a young blonde woman in armor came out of the jungle. It was Sarah. Wearing a pseudo-leather boxer shorts as a swimsuit and underwear, Jake had no qualms about having Sarah staring at him with shallow breath and a rosy face. Even her dark circles and pallor didn't detract from her beauty. One glance was enough to know that she didn't just have good intentions. Chapter 288, Playful Sarah. Did you follow me? Jake asked with a disapproving twinge of his lip. After the previous sleepless night, he didn't thought she would have the energy to leave the clearing. Yes, I did, she admitted without flinching. After the last 2 nights, I was suffocating in that clearing. I want to train with you today. What? I don't think there's enough prey for both of us if we stay this close to each other. Wait, are you listening to me? Regardless of whether or not he truly agreed, Sarah nonchalantly began to undress beside him, throwing her clothes on top of each other to form a disharmonious heap. In a few casual movements, repeated over and over again, she had gotten rid of her last clothes, and unlike Jake, she was completely naked. Seeing this nude scene, Jake swallowed his saliva with difficulty. Pineapple pizza, pineapple pizza. He hurried to invoke the traumatic image he had constructed to control his urges. Faced with this reaction, Sarah scoffed, then plunged into the water shouting, "You can watch as much as you want," not forgetting to give him one last teasing wink. Even the way she swam was enticing. She thought Jake would follow her and that she would be able to tease him all day, but he just vanished underground and never resurfaced. After a few minutes, she realized that Jake was really gone, and she punched the water angrily, scaring away the only shark she had managed to attract. About 2 hours later, Jake reappeared on the beach with a newfound calmness, and Sarah noticed that he was soaking wet too. Sarah understood that he too had been in the water since the beginning. As she swam to shore, she couldn't help but ask the question that had been bugging her. "Don't tell me you've been underwater all this time." "That's right. Specifically, I was exploring the abyss," he said with a smug face. Sarah's eyes widened when she heard that this was the truth, but her desire to tease him was stronger. "Too bad. I thought you were looking at me from underneath for a better view." Cough, cough. "It's just your imagination." Jake looked away and decisively chose to avoid this femme fatale's trap by going back into the water. Wait. I promise I'll stop." Sarah panicked when she saw that he wasn't taking the bait. She hated men playing hard to get. "Can you at least take me with you so I can unlock the abyss exploration feat?" Jake, who was about to disappear again, remained motionless for a few seconds, seeming to inspect something in the cloudless sky. She didn't know if he had heard her. As unlikely as it may seem, at this moment he was thinking the sky had gotten darker. The sun's brightness seemed dimmer, as if it shone less, or rather as if it was more distant. He hadn't noticed this the day before, but the drop in temperature of the last few days was certainly not accidental. Sarah followed his gaze, but saw nothing special except a slightly darker sky than usual. This was worth noting, but it was still early, and it could also be considered as a normal climatic phenomenon linked to a change of season. Unless Jake could see signs of a future storm of the same magnitude as the previous one, there was nothing to worry about. Even so, it was true that the water was rather cold. Even after swimming vigorously for more than an hour, she had trouble warming up and her skin had goosebumps. The occasional sea breeze did not help. In the end, Jake abandoned the idea of inferring anything from this anomaly, and he remembered the young woman's request. Deep down, he was pretty sure he would regret it, but he still agreed, feeling that he couldn't always push others away. "I can try, but in order for me not to exhaust myself, we're going to have to get as close to each other physically as possible, so please control yourself." Seeing his judgmental look as if he was dealing with a degenerate, depraved woman, Sarah felt deeply stifled inside. Did he really think she was a slut? But for the greater good, she just smiled and promised she would behave herself. In fact, even she thought she was going too far. Usually it was men who came to her, not the other way around. She had no recollection in her past life where she had been so sex-starved. On the other hand, it had been almost 6 months since she had slept with anyone. Fucking apocalypse. Jake still had doubts, but he decided to trust her. She walked up to him and wrapped her arms around his chest with no ulterior motive. She stared into his eyes, keeping her face as indifferent as possible. Then she whispered, "I'm ready." "Okay, here we go," Jake muttered in a dry voice. The young woman was still naked, and the sight on her cleavage was a feast for the eyes. Before he could fully appreciate how soft and enthralling the two spongy masses against his chest were, he dived underground with Sarah and proceeded to split the surface of the ocean floor as fast as he could so as not to be distracted. Jake didn't know what Sarah could endure in terms of pressure, but human apnea champions could easily reach 100 meters deep, so 1000 m had to be child's play for an evolver like her. Less than a minute after they left, Jake, who was intensely focused, felt the woman wiggle in his embrace. "What the fuck are you doing?" Jake asked telepathically, pinching her buttocks to call her to order. "I feel claustrophobic underground like this." Sarah justified herself hastily before regaining her stillness. Then a few seconds later, she began to wiggle again. Naturally, it didn't take long for little Jake to stand up to attention, and Sarah, being the enticing woman that she was, didn't miss this opportunity. "What's that I feel poking against my belly button?" she asked in a deceptively bashful manner. "I don't know. Probably my big machete." Jake lied without hesitation. It's true it's big. Does it fit in my hand? Spurt. When Sarah grabbed his manhood, Jake lost control of the earth around him and spat all the air into his lungs. Because of this, he accidentally swallowed salt water, and the earth around them almost engulfed them. At the brink of drowning, Jake made his way back as fast as he could and threw the young woman back onto the beach. Watching him spit out liter after liter of water, Sarah realized that she may have been messing around, but her smirk and laughing eyes revealed that she was barely holding back from laughing. After a while, she couldn't help it, and she burst out laughing. That was the last time. Jake disappeared underwater again, and this time he was careful not to reappear within a mile of the young woman. If he stayed next to this succubus, the next time would be the last. Just then, he had nearly drowned. He had seen his life flash before his eyes, and if his last memory was to remain that of the young blonde's mocking puppy face, his mind would never be at peace. He was dying for revenge, but one look at the young woman staring at him while biting her lower lip made him understand that this was exactly what she was waiting for. On the verge of exploding inside, he could only do what he did best, keeping his distance. For a long time, the young woman remained alone on the beach with a flushed face in the hope that Jake would come back, but it was a lost cause. As aroused as she was, she foolishly waited for him for almost half an hour, and then sadly realized that she had scared him off. In the end, she had to resign herself to masturbate all alone in order to appease her burning body, but not without an intense sense of frustration. When had she been pussy-blocked in her life? Never. Seeing that he was serious and that she had missed her chance, she finally calmed down and started hunting seriously. The day went by without any new twists, and in the middle of the afternoon, she decided to return to the clearing without him. After all, he was a big boy. He could take care of himself. Chapter 289: Second Encounter with the Abyss Boss. With Jake no longer having to worry about the deadly attacks of this horny woman, he was finally able to devote himself completely to his goal, to achieve all of the abyss hunting feats at the gold level. It was by following this pattern that he had earned the Apex Ocean Predator title, and he hoped to obtain a new glyph by doing the same in the ocean depths. The truth was that Jake was not indifferent to Sarah's charm, but he was even more terrified of failing because he couldn't set his priorities straight. At the speed at which the situation was evolving on B842 and the ordeal itself, a few hours of fooling around could have unpredictable consequences, especially if another player was conspiring in the shadows with her shadow guide to exploit the slightest flaw. It was against the backdrop of this constant anxiety that Jake was able to keep a cool head. Maybe going for a quickie wasn't really an issue, and it wouldn't have been of any consequence, but the mere possibility that it might happen was enough to drive him out of this madness. There was no doubt that many humans had, on the contrary, chosen not to worry about tomorrow, even if it meant falling into the worst kind of depravity like Yerode and Lamine. But he had the deep conviction that all these people would pay dearly for this negligence in a not-so-distant future, and then they would come to him begging for his protection. But Jake was not a Samaritan and never had been. Protecting his loved ones and tolerating the presence of strangers was already taking a lot of social effort from him. If it were up to him, he would have gone for a month-long nap at the volcano until the Phantom Sanctuary landing. It didn't matter if he ended up being the only one alive and 3 meters tall after that. At that time, he would have been strong enough. It was more than likely that other players had acted exactly like that, choosing to go into seclusion to isolate themselves and increase their abilities without worrying about anything. Therefore, if he wanted to stay competitive, he had to make the most of his time. And deep down, he was sure that Sarah felt the same way. The only reason she was not able to was the nature of her Myrmidian bloodline and the fact that her sexual and social life had originally been very active. Combined with the stress and sleep deprivation of the last 2 days, she was having trouble adjusting to the change. Unless an outside influence was at work, considering the near psychotic state of his companions, this was not impossible. Perhaps this mysterious presence was not just spying on them. A shame he had not noticed anything unusual. Anyway, training and hunting was the way to go. After resting for a few minutes, Jake dived one last time before nightfall. After getting the soul glyph, Extreme Diver, his snorkeling abilities at full power had increased from more or less 15 minutes to more than an hour. With the help of his ether skills, holding on for 2 hours was not difficult either. If his survival depended on it, He could even induce a near lethargic state to his body in order to survive by relying only on the oxygen that the pores of his skin could passively absorb from the water. The greatest benefit of this new glyph was that he could no longer drown, except when a certain blonde woman became kinky. Nevertheless, Jake was far from being invincible, and a very high-intensity fight was still a risk for him if it lasted too long, and a deadly threat if he was wounded thousands of meters below the surface. This morning, after fleeing from Sarah, he had accomplished the platinum feat of reaching the 5,000-meter deep zone. The new soul glyph had a lot to do with it, and he had been rewarded with 5 million ether points. It had gone unnoticed, but his position in the player ranking had suddenly climbed to the 19th place with almost 10 million points. Many participants had already memorized his name when he had killed a Nosk, and this new twist had established a lasting impression on them. So it was with a certain self-confidence that he dived again at the end of the afternoon. Like the previous times, he rushed towards the 1,000–2,000-meter depth zone and began to chase away anything that deigned to approach him at less than 10 meters. His points climbed quickly, but he still had a few more feats to complete. Blind in the darkness, he slashed all the ether masses that his spirit body could detect. Some of these creatures offered no resistance when he sliced them with his machete, while others were so hard-shelled that he had to slash them several times to finish them off. There were also those elusive prehistoric monsters that required superior strength to be defeated. In these cases, telekinesis, heat, and muscle enhancement with ether to accelerate a devastating stroke worked miracles. Until now, no sea monster had been able to withstand such a blow. Not all of them died from it, but it was enough to deter these abyssal creatures from attacking it again. It was on this solid foundation that he intended to end the day, and unfortunately, whenever things went well, something would always go wrong. As dusk was setting in, and he was about to make his way back, the only ocean monster he hoped to never meet again decided to pay him a second visit. In contrast to the first encounter, where the monster had circled around him a few times before hitting him with its tail or a tentacle, the tremendous ether mass perceived by his spirit body directly rammed into him like a missile. His mind only perceived a fascinating and luminous mass of ether, but it was concealing an otherworldly monster with a size and ferocity beyond compare. Upon impact, an underwater shock wave blasted Jake away, and he spun around within the ocean currents without being able to stabilize. Half of his air had been expelled from his lungs on impact, and he felt an almost irrepressible nausea at this depth. The urge to hyperventilate to catch his breath was overwhelming, and he had to use all his wits to suppress this sensation. The shadow guide didn't work. Jake ranted inwardly. Whenever the threat was real, the oracle system seemed to fail him. The only good news was that he hadn't fractured anything apart from the radius and ulna of his forearm. It was a clean fracture, and an average human might have cried like a baby, but after his previous injuries it was nothing. Regardless, he was still incapacitated. Switching to telekinesis mode to propel himself, he hurried to the seabed without delay, and it was the best decision he ever made. Boom! Another underwater shockwave exploded at his former position, and if he had stayed there, he would certainly have died. After seeing the resilience of its prey, the monster had recalibrated its striking power. Like an underwater comet, Jake tried to dive into the ocean floor, but instead of finding the sand that would allow him to disappear and move at full speed, his head hit a hard surface. Fuck. Why now? He cursed without bothering about the huge bump forming on his forehead. As in his first trial, he had landed in an area where the Naquat deposit was above ground. There was no sand or soil where he was, only rock and a giant and indestructible green soul stone. After swimming so much, he had a pretty good knowledge of these waters and immediately started looking for a practicable ground. He hadn't dared to risk it during the first trial, but these deposits never took up too much space. Had he not been swept away by the sea currents generated by the monster, he would never have made such a mistake. Jake started groping around, winding like a drunken torpedo that had lost its target, and several times a second he would send a mental impulse with his spirit body to scan the ground nearby. After a few seconds, he found a space without any rocks or deposits, but it was too late. The boss of the abyss had caught up with him, and a huge clawed leg several times his size crushed him against the sand with the violence of a fly swatter. He was the fly. Even with his telekinesis acting as a cushion, his new ether stats, and his new body, he was smashed to pieces. The only thing that saved him was that at the very last instant he had placed the tip of his machete in the monster's striking path. Driven by its own momentum, the monster's clawed paw impaled itself into its machete up to the hilt, and the pain caused the creature to pull back before Jake was fully crushed. Seriously injured, he vanished into the sand and returned to the beach as fast as he could, but he was no longer able to walk. Knowing the procedure while there was still some sunlight, he buried himself in the sand in a pool of blood and passed out. When he woke up a few hours later in the middle of the night, his injuries were stabilized and he was able to walk again. But moments later, as he approached the hill where his base was hidden, a smell of smoke and blood came over him, and remembering his bad feeling from 2 days ago, he hurried back to the clearing. The trees were in flames, dinosaur and other monster corpses as far as the eye could see, and blood all over the place. The stone house had been completely razed to the ground. Chapter 290: Exasperation. Instinctively, the first thing Jake had in mind was rushing to the stone house ruins in search of survivors. But when he found the extent of the carnage, he took a step back. The only way his companions could have survived was to have fled or been left for dead. Otherwise, they would still be fighting. As mighty as Jake may be, he had no effective way to put out the wildfire. Theoretically, he should have been able to create a vacuum zone with his telekinesis to deprive the flames of oxygen or absorb their heat with his own body, but the latter ability was passive. He didn't have much control over it. As for his telekinesis, his control over a fire of this magnitude was far from absolute. He could only hope that it would rain or that the fire would stop on its own. With the recent drop in temperature, it was not impossible. On top of that, he was still injured. He was really hoping that no monsters were still lurking around, or he might spend a nasty night. Walking calmly around the clearing with a gloomy look on his face, Jake coldly inspected every inch of the battlefield. Every single trap had been triggered, but very few of the beasts had been caught. None of his companions in the camp had the power to command fire, but he could not ignore the possibility that one of them had hidden his game or that the enemy was responsible for the fire. If it was an enemy, the hypothesis of another player was more likely, but the presence of so many creatures rather supported that of the mysterious presence which had been spying on them for several days. Quite coincidentally, it had struck while he was away. Oh well. Jake, who had barely begun to examine the rubble, raised his head briskly when he heard this beastly howl. It sounded like the cry of a wolf. The howl seemed near and far at the same time. He couldn't tell if it was one of the monsters that had attacked their base. Should I go there or not? Jake hesitated momentarily, torn between satisfying his curiosity and playing it safe. Thinking about something else, he tried to locate Sarah, Kevin, and the others to see if the screams were coming from the same direction. To his surprise, most of them were still alive. Only his uncle Elijah was impossible to locate alive. Knowing that he had not specified his comrade's status in his wish to locate them, being impossible to locate meant that the body no longer existed. He had probably been dismembered and devoured by a group of beasts, hence the impossibility of giving a clear answer. On the other hand, all the others except Tim and Lily were together, apparently heading towards the heart of the island. Jake was slightly taken aback when he realized that it was the same direction as the volcano where he had discovered the secret underpass. Still thinking that the last events were just coincidences was now quite impossible. Weird. Why aren't Tim and Lily with the others? Did they manage to escape? Neither are the Zwits. Jake was baffled by this riddle. Remembering Tim's bloodline and his ability to sense danger, that he was able to miraculously escape was not so surprising. It should not be forgotten that he had survived the pursuit of the Krish trio, occupying the top 5 of the player rankings. Well, there were only 2 of them left after one of them had been killed by a human. Taking a look at the said player rankings, Jake was appalled to learn that the number of participants had dropped sharply yet again. There were now less than 1,500 participants. What's going on here? Jake couldn't help but wonder upon seeing this. Have these monsters been ordered to cooperate to purge the island of its participants, or is this just one more test to overcome? The ordeals are unpredictable, she tactfully reminded him. There was an ordeal where all the candidates were eliminated in the first minute because a meteorite had hit the planet where the ordeal was taking place. In principle, this cannot happen if this world is in the mirror universe or under its jurisdiction, but remembers that the oracle is not infallible. No kidding. Jake scoffed. If he hadn't figured it out by then, he could as well commit suicide right now. I'm not kidding. The oracle system guarantees your survival during the first 4 ordeals, but that's also why it can afford to take certain risks it wouldn't normally take. This asteroid is in the system. My memories are inaccessible, but a world this old can only have been abandoned for 2 reasons. Another entity comparable to the oracle has taken control of it, or the digesters have long since eradicated those who resided here. The mere fact that such a sanctuary still exists is a miracle in itself, and therefore it is impossible for such a place to be normal. The fact that your bracelet is so unreliable here is further proof of this. Now that she was pointing out these anomalies, Jake couldn't help but imagine the worst. His first ordeal, which was supposed to be the most relaxed, had already been fucked up by an invasion of digesters and system as 16 deserters. What was the likelihood for his second ordeal to be just as fucked up? The second ordeal is the same for everyone. Using the authorization level of your oracle rank, I can at least confirm from the accessible archives that it always happens in similar sanctuary bubbles of System A0. So there is no need to panic. The oracle must have some kind of deal with the Zorians living here. She's reassuring speech managed to placate him, but not completely. Everything that had happened since he had received his bracelet was so bizarre and unbelievable that he had trouble distinguishing what was reliable from what was not. One thing at a time. I find Tim and Lily and work out a plan to save Sarah and the others. Jake braced himself by slapping his cheeks with both hands to divert his pessimistic thoughts. Unsurprisingly, he found Tim and Lily hiding in the trunk of a dead tree a few kilometers from the hill. It was almost unbelievable how they had gotten there without warning the others, but Jake had to accept their explanation. Squeezing Lily's hand with a flushed face, but tinged with pride and joy like a dog wagging its tail after bringing back a ball, Tim stuttered with embarrassment that he and Lily had wanted to go for a night stroll as lovers, and that sensing extreme danger approaching, they had hidden and decided to wait for things to calm down. In the end, huddled together in that tree trunk, they had let their hormones kick in and shared their first kisses. Fuck. Jake was speechless. He had literally shunned Sarah's advances so as not to get distracted while the 2 kids were openly flirting during the night, when the island's creatures were at their most active. Why am I even bothering about them? He sighed as he decided to ignore them from now on. Worrying about them was not good for his mental health. As for the 2 Zewids, he found them a few kilometers away from the hill as well, but for a completely different reason. With what he deduced from their motives via his telepathy, he learned that they had simply set off in quest of honey. The poodle Zewid had found a prehistoric hive of bees and greedy, as it had chosen to keep the secret to itself. Bad luck for it. The brown Zewid had found it suspicious and had followed it at nightfall. When Jake had found them, the 2 teddy bears were in a recovery position. Their bellies were round, and their noses were smeared with honey after having stuffed themselves until they couldn't move anymore. Face-palming and overwhelmed with a sudden tiredness that made him want to let go and throw in the towel, Jake decided to stop caring about them as well. Otherwise, he risked giving in to his impulses and adding 4 more kills to his record. Nonetheless, he ordered them all to return to the base, and when he saw their shaking at the sight of the carnage, he regained some of his inner peace. They were not yet beyond redemption. But seeing the 2 Zewids digging in panic with their little hands to unearth an intact roasted T-Rex thigh and hugging it in their arms with tears streaming down their faces as if they had just been reunited with their loved one after a long separation, Jake lost hope for good. Whatever. Their base no longer existed. Jake advised the children and Zewids to hide and be careful in his absence. He particularly insisted that it was possible that they might not meet again until the end of this ordeal, and that they should act as such. The enemy capable of capturing Sarah, Kevin, and Lu Yen would be a tough foe. Then Jake set off, without looking back. Chapter 291, The Only Escapee. At least that was his intention. Barely a few steps away, he turned around as he remembered an important detail. One more thing. Do you still feel this presence? I mean that feeling of being spied on unbeknownst to you. Tim and Lily were startled as they listened to his question, but when they began to carefully contemplate how they felt, a disillusioned surprise settled on their childish faces. The presence was completely gone. Everything was back to the way it was before. Actually, The feeling of imminent danger had also diminished significantly as they had moved away from the clearing. Seeing their reaction, Jake didn't need to hear their reply. He had already gotten the information he wanted. Barring a miracle, Sarah and the others had been captured. Otherwise, they had no reason to move away from the clearing in the same direction and further towards the center of the island, which was even more dangerous. To maximize their chances of survival in the face of a land enemy, heading towards the beach where he was training would have made much more sense. They could also have disbanded to make it more difficult for their pursuers. Jake had hastened to set out to rescue them, but after tumbling down the hill and into the jungle again, he began to regret his choice. The night was still young and visibility was at a minimum. The creatures were active, and for those with red blood, they were in their berserk state. He could regularly hear a roar or a beastly howl resonating from a distance almost impossible to assess. His wounds had not yet fully recovered, and he had no choice but to move underground at a moderate speed to avoid being exposed to a group of rabid enemies. Despite this, his movement speed could not be considered slow, and he expected to catch up with his fellow prisoners in a short time. For this reason, his face grew more and more grim and ugly as the night passed without him finding any trace of their passing. From time to time, Jake would sneak up to the surface in search of clues such as footprints or the passage of a group of beasts, but there was none of that. Either their attacker was incredibly good at covering their tracks, or they had not used the land route to get around. If, like Jake, it could fly, it could effectively cover up any trace of their passage, but transporting an entire group through the air was a whole different matter. With his present abilities, he could do the same, but it was not without its drawbacks for his own mental fatigue. The weight of his companions was not the issue here, but dividing his attention to make several people levitate was. It was like holding one's arm up in the air in front of oneself with a 2 kilograms dumbbell in the hand. The first few seconds would be effortless, but after a minute or two it would start to sting. Even the simplest gestures, if executed under constant tension, without any resting time, could become unbearable in the long run. That's why Jake at least expected the culprit to have landed every now and then to rest. Even if it was only for a second or two, it would have given him or her the rest time he or she needed to fly properly. The absence of tracks was therefore particularly disturbing, but there was also the possibility that, like him, their assailant had used the underground method to travel. Except that even when scanning the ground at a radius of 25 meters, he had found nothing that might suggest that the galleries below the volcano extended all the way to the outermost parts of the island. In the end, Jake arrived at the volcano at dawn without having met anyone except for an epileptic Dilophosaurus and a fucking Diplodocus that had decided to go after him instead of eating grass or leaves like any self-respecting herbivore. The first dinosaur was not much of a problem. Jake had twisted his neck with a simple telekinetic slap, but the second one was a major hindrance. The dinosaur was so big that Jake would have preferred to bypass it, but for some reason it had decided to camp out in front of the entrance to the secret underpass. Such a prehistoric monster had no business being on the slope of a volcano where vegetation was scarce, but it was there anyway, determined to stand in its way. If Jake had been in the jungle, he could easily have avoided it by moving underground. But it happened that the surface of the volcano, except for a few centimeters of accumulated ash, was mostly rocky and formed by the accumulation of cooled lava. Escape through the ground was therefore impossible. Drawing his machete, Jake first tried to probe this gigantic opponent using the easy way. With his telekinesis, he tried to twist the monster's neck or to crush its carotids to asphyxiate it, but nothing worked. The sun was not yet fully up and the berserk state of the Diplodocus had not yet subsided. The reddish bestial aura emanating from the monster was repelling its attempts to control it. The ether inside the dinosaur and in its immediate surroundings was beyond his grasp. Jake had already recognized the fist-sized red crystal embedded in the monster's forehead. The creature seemed to be obeying orders and would stop attacking him as soon as he distanced himself from it. As soon as he got within 50 meters of the entrance to the secret passage, it would attack him again. After a few minutes, Jake decided to retreat temporarily to think of another plan that he was confident that he could defeat the monster in hand-to-hand combat. But the ruckus would not go unnoticed. It was better to wait for the monster to suffer the repercussions of his berserk state once the sun was fully up. He checked with his shadow guide the current position of Sarah and the others, and his eyes suddenly bulged when he noticed that Lu Yin was not with them. This bitch. From the beginning, he thought that she had been taken prisoner by this mysterious enemy because the shadow guide had been showing that she was in the same direction as the rest of the group. It was only now when he reached the foot of the volcano that he realized that she was now behind him. Vanishing underground again, he rushed towards the Asian woman like a missile and dragged her underground, pulling down her feet before she could do anything. Re-solidifying the ground around her, Lu Yin rediscovered the intense joy of being buried except for her head and her neck, which protruded like a recalcitrant nail. Powerless, she tried to use her own telekinesis to dislodge herself from this earth cage, but to no avail. "You are dreaming if you think you can escape from Earth under my control," Jake jibed sardonically as he saw the young woman struggling. Recognizing the deep voice of the culprit, Lu Yin immediately stopped struggling. Twisting her head back in an attempt to see Jake behind her, she spewed as fast as she could. "It's not what you think. I swear, I wanted to help them." The fervor in her voice seemed sincere, and her expression showed a certain resolution. However, even for today's Jake, this level of acting was child's play, not to mention Lu Yin, who was an expert at lying. "So why are you the only one out there?" Jake asked with a smirk. "Because I can fly, and I'm stronger mentally," Lu Yin answered instantly, as if she had anticipated his question a long time ago. "Explain." Seeing that Jake seemed willing to listen to her, she wasted no time and told everything she knew. It turned out that their base had indeed been attacked early last night, but it had not been the crushing defeat he had imagined. At first, the fight had been more in their favor, as evidenced by all the monster corpses strewn over the clearing. The situation had turned sour when the mysterious presence had moved into action. Two giant hairless humanoid monsters with obsidian-colored skin had appeared out of nowhere and neutralized Sarah and Kevin in an instant. Lu Yin, who was in battle with another enemy, had immediately fled into the air when she witnessed this nightmarish scene. "Why didn't you save them after fleeing? I'm sure you can use your powers to make them fly with you for a few minutes, right?" Jake picked up on an obscure part of her explanation. "I tried and I've almost died." Lu Yin shook her head as she remembered the event. "What do you mean?" "The mysterious presence that kept us awake at night showed up." Lu Yin sighed with a shiver running down her spine. He looked like one of those dark elves in heroic fantasy video games. His eyes were blood red and had a hypnotic glow. I recognized those eyes right away. When I used my telekinesis to save them, he looked up at me, and I've blacked out. I fell from the sky like a rock and regained consciousness down the hill just before hitting the ground. Realizing what had just happened to me, I used the cover of the jungle to escape. There was no way I could have saved them. When I went back up the hill, they were already gone, and the presence I had felt for 3 days had disappeared. Chapter 292. We Rescrewed. A silence lingered between them after the young woman's story, each of them immersed in their own reflections. Jake had come to save them, but it was now clear to him that he had virtually no chance of defeating this alien by brute force. The big question was whether he would be able to remain conscious in the face of a soul attack from this creature. When she fainted in the air, Lu Yin had only regained consciousness at the last moment, a few meters before hitting the ground. The hillside where their base was concealed was more than 50 meters high and stood on a small cliff, forcing them to make a slight detour when climbing. Considering the height of the fall and the time it took for the body to gain speed, it was not difficult to estimate that she had passed out for at least 3 seconds. On that basis, Jake thought he was capable of withstanding such a mental attack, but it was on the premise that this alien had used its full power. Given how it had squashed them like bugs, it was rather unlikely. Restless, Jake advanced to the edge of the jungle to peer at the volcano where the watchful Diplodocus was standing guard. Even with the sun rising, the dinosaur hadn't yet shown the slightest sign of the tiredness expected from the end of its berserk state. Seeing the giant monster turning its long neck in all directions so as not to miss any details, Jake's face darkened. Lu Yin was standing quietly behind him, but by hearing her gnashing her teeth, he could tell that she was trying to keep her legs from running away. "Jake, I don't think this is a good idea," she suggested in a tone as courteous and docile as she could. "Even if we don't save them, their score for this ordeal should be outstanding. We have no reason to risk our lives for them." We can always compensate them afterwards." The words had been let out. She had said her piece. If Jake thought once again that she was just a manipulative and selfish bitch, so be it. As expected, Jake gave her a stern glare when he heard her proposal, but contrary to what she feared, he didn't punish her. "You're right. Saving them is too risky," Jake admitted after a while with a concerned wrinkle on his forehead. "In that case, what do we do?" Lu Yin asked, holding back a deep sigh of relief. She had been afraid that he would act irrationally in this situation. "Well, we go in all the same." At that precise moment, the brief relief that had pervaded Lu Yin and relaxed her face faded away, replaced by outright despair. She could not understand why he was so anxious to save them. She could understand if death was final in this ordeal, but it was not. She knew that with his abilities, she would never have taken such a risk. Sensing what was going through her head, Jake immediately corrected her. "Don't get me wrong. Saving them is one of the objectives, but even if they had not been captured, I would have come here on my own. I have a quest that requires me to explore the secret passage leading to the underground galleries beneath the volcano." Oh, so that was the reason? For a moment, she had believed that her nemesis had changed completely, becoming almost a person of chivalrous virtues with a strong sense of brotherhood and sacrifice. She was almost relieved to learn that she was wrong. However, if there was indeed such a quest, it changed everything. Lu Yan's fear and doubts were quickly overshadowed by a surge of greed, and it was enough to give her the courage she previously didn't think she had. If she was alone, she would never have set foot on that volcano, but with Jake it was different. If Jake was able to complete the quest directly, simply traveling with him would guarantee her the same exploration rewards. "When do we go?" Lu Yin inquired with an enthusiastic pitch so genuine that for a second Jake thought that the alien's mental attack had burned out all her brain cells. However, when he remembered who he was dealing with, he was not so confused anymore. Out of greed and ambition, the young woman had taken the risk of stealing his ether during the Colosseum battle of the first ordeal. This proved that despite her apparent calm and intelligence, the young woman had a nasty flaw. And that flaw was the inability to control herself when subjected to a strong feeling of avarice. A flawed psychopath. Well, Jake hadn't yet decided if she was a real psychopath or just a selfish, cold bitch, but it was clear that she had a screw loose. "Not right away, that will go when I'm cured, and when this Diplodocus has gone into lethargy," he finally replied after seriously considering all the possibilities. Because of this dinosaur, Jake couldn't even go back to training in the volcanic chamber. If he went through the air, there was a definite risk that he would be spotted. Going to the other side of the volcano was not a solution either. Since Lu Yin had arrived before him, she had enough time to go around the volcano, and this dinosaur was by no means the only one. The most likely scenario was that there was not just one secret entrance, but several. The number of dinosaurs standing guard was small, but their sheer size and strength made their combined defense almost impenetrable to the average player. Healing was not the issue in this case. Jake and Lu Yin found a relatively isolated corner and cut down the surrounding trees to create a sunny space. Otherwise, the dense foliage of these tropical trees obstructed most of the rays. It was rather cold, and Jake lamented that the sun above them was weakly shining as if it was already late afternoon, but he was content with that. As long as he had good soil and enough heat or radiation, he could heal the worst wounds in no time. "Go get some wood and keep the fire going until I'm back on the surface," Jake calmly commanded the young woman who was watching his little game without really understanding what he was trying to do. Knowing that challenging him would only bring her trouble, Lu Yin complied without further ado and returned a few minutes later with enough logs and twigs to fuel an inferno for several days. A machete sharpened with gray ether combined with telekinesis was the perfect logger kit. She had never seen Jake bury himself in the ground for anything other than moving or fighting, and that's why she was quite puzzled when Jake asked her to look after the fire. With his powers, Jake lit the campfire with a snap of his finger and buried himself directly under the flames. If he could, he would have even jumped directly into the fire, but the soil covering him would have extinguished the flames. After his coma under the volcano, his body could tolerate prolonged contact against weak, warm-colored flames as long as he did not expose himself directly to the central flames from which the combustion started. In the first case, The temperature was only a few hundred degrees Celsius, while in the second case, the bluish flames could exceed 1400 C. There were other factors affecting the temperature or color of a flame, but there was nothing to worry about in a conventional wood combustion. Once underground, he closed his eyes, and as usual, he focused on absorbing the heat and nutrients from the soil around him to speed up his healing. His body was also slightly tempered by the process, but compared to his training under the volcano, it was laughable. About 2 hours later, Jake emerged from his earthen grave, his torso being licked directly by the flame's edge of the campfire without showing any sign of pain. Lu Yin wondered what Jake was doing underneath, but seeing the veins on his skin glowing like lava rivers, her curiosity was satisfied. He was now completely healed. Alas, what should have restored his confidence for the upcoming operation was immediately dampened with a disturbing discovery. It was dark again. No, it can't be. It shouldn't even be noon. Did I sleep so long? Jake wondered with a certain disbelief on his face. But when he received the time confirmation from his bracelet, he had to face the facts. Actually, by looking more closely at the sky, Jake noticed that the sun had not disappeared, but its light was now barely brighter than a standard full moon. What the fuck is happening here? You have another, more urgent problem, she declared by making pop up several previous scan reports in his mind. Reviewing the characteristics of the humanoid monsters and the recent increase in night attacks on players, as well as the increased activity of the island's beasts at night, a terrible foreboding overtook him. We're screwed. Chapter 293 Soul Arrow. Jake thought briefly of an eclipse, but the sunlight was not obstructed by a moon, or a black sphere would have been enclosed by the star's rays. The sun really seemed to be more distant. Out of habit, he tried in vain to deduce by what astrophysical phenomenon such an incongruity could occur, but he quickly gave up. It did not matter. It was no longer a simulation as in the first or second trial, but the sky was definitely fake. Otherwise, these Zorian survivors would not have needed to build these sanctuary bubbles on a desolate asteroid. The only conclusion to be drawn was that just like the blizzard of about 3 weeks ago, the sanctuary bubble had decided to put them through another test. And this new challenge was a daunting one. Until then, they had been relatively safe on the island during the day because most of the island's creatures were either weakened or dormant after being under the nighttime influence of the Flintium and Orxanium ores. Traveling at night had always been extremely risky, and if Jake could not travel underground, he would never have been so reckless. From now on, and if night became permanent, the island would become dangerous by day and night. The creatures would no longer suffer any after effects after their nocturnal berserk state, and the effects of the various soul stones on the local flora and fauna would become permanent. The changes this would bring about were difficult to predict, but it did not bode well for the remaining participants. Even worse, those aliens and creatures that Jake thought were the Zorian descendants would no longer need to burrow underground. In recent days, this race had begun to hunt down the remaining players and deployed many creatures under their control. Each consecutive night, the number of participants had been reduced from 100 to 200, and he could not imagine the consequences this would have now that these aliens could continue to hunt in the middle of the day. Last but not least was the lack of light. With their perception stats, darkness was no longer really a problem, but it was still a fact that this detail did not work to their advantage. Humans without a particular bloodline would be at an even greater disadvantage compared to those whose night vision was part of their species or bloodline kit. Anyway, the worst news for him was that his original plan to delay until the Diplodocus weakened was now obsolete. Whatever his approach to enter this tunnel was, he would have to take on this dinosaur at full power. What do we do now, Jake? Lu Yin asked, clutching the hilt of her sword with trepidation. It wasn't him that she distrusted, but the jungle itself. The frantic roaring and grunting that had stopped a few hours earlier was slowly coming back to life. As darkness had returned, the eyes of these sleeping creatures had begun to glow a ruby or sapphire glow again, and it was only then that she realized that no matter how quiet the jungle might appear during the day, it was never empty. Hundreds of blue and red irises were forming an ominous firmament in the foliage of the trees around them, and it wouldn't be long before their violent impulses kicked in. Also aware of the danger, Jake frowned, but he didn't have any good solutions to offer either. Their base was originally safe, but with the hypothetical Zorians chasing the participants, it was no longer a reliable hiding place. There was no doubt that these aliens knew the island inside out. He just hoped that Tim's luck and sense of danger would allow him and Lily to make it through. Because unfortunately, his previous decision was still valid. His intention to explore the secret underground passage had not wavered. Let me see how strong is this fucking creature in his berserk state. A month earlier, he certainly wouldn't have dared to face this Diplodocus head-on. But with his recent progress and his wounds completely healed, he was ready to give it a new try. If that wasn't enough, he would go back to the volcano to take a nap. Seeing that Jake had made his choice and not daring to contradict him, Lu Yin breathed an umpteenth disappointed sigh, and they set off again. Jake grabbed her by the shoulder, and they slipped into the ground. A few minutes later, they were back at the foot of the volcano. How are you going to do it? Lu Yin inquired again in order to calm down. No matter how she interpreted the situation, this Diplodocus was a tough fellow to deal with. Scornfully grunting, Jake simply drew his machete and strode fiercely towards the behemoth. Recognizing the cockroach of this morning, the Diplodocus savagely stomped the ground as a warning. A cloud of dust was raised in response. The earth shook and the rock in contact with this massive leg cracked immediately. The red crystal in the middle of its forehead kept the monster lucid. Jake was momentarily speechless. How heavy this dinosaur had to be to break the rock floor with a simple stomping motion. To accomplish the same feat, he would have needed to use much of his strength, and he was pretty sure that the earth would not have shaken like that. Like the first time, Jake tested the creature's mental defenses, but the aura of reddish ether coloring the monster's soul immediately dissipated the psychic energy contained in his attack. Only this time he decided not to give up so easily. Placing both hands against the pommel of his sword where the green soul stone was inserted, Jake began to channel the soul energy contained within. He then compressed his spirit body around him like a spring and formed an immaterial arrow where he concentrated all his rage to vanquish. After his fight against the Nosk, this was the technique he had perfected to defend himself and retaliate if such a situation were to occur again. When he released his control, his spirit body unfolded like a cannonball, and the tip of the arrow pierced the bestial aura of the Diplodocus like a meteorite smiting the ocean and went straight for the head. This mental attack that was carried by Jake's consciousness formed a momentary gap, as if a vacuum had just formed in the monster's spirit body, and he infiltrated this breach without hesitation. Within milliseconds, Jake activated his telekinesis and blew up all the large arteries and veins that irrigated the monster's brain. The skull of this dinosaur was undoubtedly sturdy, but the brain inside was as soft and spongy as any other soft tissue. Faced with the full power of his telekinesis, the organ was reduced to a pulp in an instant. The long neck of the Diplodocus began to rock dangerously. Then the gigantic body of the monster wobbled from left to right before collapsing heavily to the ground. Lu Yin was already tearing her hair out with both hands when the dinosaur had started to stagger, but when she saw the blood flowing out of all its orifices, she almost had a heart attack. God damn it. Why did we have to wait so long if you could kill it in less than a second? Of course, she didn't say that, but her accusing and indignant stare said it all. To tell the truth, even Jake could hardly believe it. He had recently conceptualized these new techniques through his experiences, but he had never tried them against worthy opponents. But when he saw the results, he realized how overpowered his spirit body was when it was given the right weapon. From the beginning, he had used his mind as a rudimentary means of controlling the ether around him. It was like facing a knight in armor and sword barehanded. Completely futile. It worked as long as he had overwhelming physical superiority, but if the enemy had any talent at all, even a child could have beaten him. One might have thought that with his present intelligence he could have figured it out sooner, and in fact he did. He had a lot of such ideas in his bag. The only reason he didn't use them was because he didn't think they would work so well. More importantly, a month earlier his ether control was much worse than it was now. What he had just accomplished today was due to the progress of his mental stats, both physically and etherically, but more specifically, to all the hours he had spent trying to train his ether core. The very last key element was the green soul stone. By imbuing his spirit body with this special energy, his mental attack had acquired a neutralizing property on the murderous and chaotic aura resulting from the influence of the red soul stone. With this accomplishment, Jake realized that he no longer had anything to fear from participants with no mental defenses to speak of. Some may have had bloodlines or purchased effective ether skills in this area, but for all others, it was a glaring weakness. Despite his excitement, he was not blinded. Such an advantage was only possible because the majority of the players were not yet aware of the danger of these psychic attacks. After being captured or killed by these Zorians, all these participants would become extremely alert on this matter for the next ordeals. As for those who had been eliminated in the first trial, chances were that they would remain ignorant about the subject for an extended period of time. Chapter 294 Underground Maze. Once the Diplodocus died, Jake quickly removed the red crystal inserted in its forehead. According to Lu Yin and the others, another creature had always hurried to retrieve it before they could retrieve one. Therefore, he wanted to make sure that there wasn't a difference or an important detail that he may have missed from the one analyzed during his second trial. Spending the ether point required for the scan, Jake checked the crystal analysis report line by line, but he soon shook his head in disappointment. The information provided was identical. In other words, apart from serving as a vessel for the dinosaur's soul, he still didn't know much more. Nevertheless, if the spirit of these creatures and the program governing their behavior was contained in these crystals, it was logical that the owner would seek to recover them in case of death. By inserting the crystal into another body, he could easily create new minions, although Jake was not sure if it was that simple. So, Lu Yin asked carefully beside him, "Nothing special. We have to move on before one of his buddies notices its condition." Okay. There were indeed other dinosaurs roaming on the different slopes of the volcano. Even if these monsters moved little and tended to camp in the area assigned to them, they were not safe from having their fight been seen by someone else. Losing interest in the crystal and the colossal corpse in front of him, Jake used his physical strength, earth control, and telekinesis combined to move the rock blocking the entrance to the secret passage. Even with his psychic abilities, he had to repeat the process several times to manage to open enough space for him and Lu Yin to pass through. They could have taken the lift concealed on the ground, but they had found no way to activate it. Similarly, they had difficulty understanding how these aliens normally managed to move the rock covering the secret passage. Unless their physical and psychic strength was far superior to his, he could not see how such a people could enter and leave so easily through this passage. Though, with a Diplodocus like the one he had just fought, pushing the rock should be child's play. There must have been a lever or something like that hidden nearby, but they didn't have time for that. Having managed to access the secret passage in another way, Jake wasted no more time and entered the underground gallery without further ado. Just after walking a few meters inside the tunnel, he realized that it was going to be a real chore to travel in there. There were no torches, lamps, or candles inside this wide corridor carved into the volcano. They were in complete darkness. "I have a bad feeling about this, Jake. We'd better get out of here before this ends badly," Lu Yin commented with a tone between frustration and regret. "You can run away whenever you want, but don't count on me to help you when it's your turn to be chased by these aliens." Jake replied curtly, "Now shut up. We're not alone here." After only a few hundred meters, they heard grunting noises not far from them, and seconds later, 6 reddish glows belonging to 3 distinct creatures appeared in front of them at an intersection. Before the 3 monsters had even had time to sniff their presence, Jake had already decapitated 2 of them. Lu Yin had also reacted promptly, and even though her telekinesis did not work properly on these monsters, just like Jake, she knew how to use a sword. They hadn't taken gladiator training for nothing. Seconds later, silence was back in the dark tunnel, and a metallic smell lingered in the air. The duo resumed their march, but this time they took extra care to watch their gait to minimize the noise of their footsteps. For Jake it was simple. Floating like a ghost a few centimeters above the ground, he would glide along the surface of the ground, scanning the corridor in front of him several times a second with psychic impulses. As for Lu Yin, she did the same, but had to lay her feet on the ground briefly from time to time to relieve her budding headache. The gallery network turned out to be much more tortuous and winding than they had originally imagined, and they hit dead ends several times. On other occasions, they crossed the entire volcano and ended up on the other side of it, sometimes on the mountainside, sometimes directly in the jungle. This was a real problem for Jake, because he could confirm through his shadow guide that Sarah and the others were under the volcano, But no matter how much they explored these galleries, they could not find any passage to go deeper down to reach them. Yet, as time went by, his bracelet did its job, as did his memory. The mapping function was mapping more and more of this underground network, and by elimination, they were getting closer and closer to their goal. As the scope of options narrowed, Jake and Lu Yin began to take the right paths more and more often, and the presence of creatures standing guard grew more intense. At first there were only 2 or 3 monsters, but now it was usually 7 or 8. Each time they managed to eliminate them before one of them could escape, but it was getting harder and harder. "Jake, if you keep going in that direction, you're going to commit suicide." Lu Yin complained telepathically for the 9th consecutive time since they entered the underground maze. They had just survived an encounter against a pack of rabid guard dogs, and for the first time, the young woman had been injured. Blood was dripping from her right forearm after a violent bite, and without the armor Jake had made for her, she could have lost her arm. Jake didn't care about Lu Yan's grievances, but he had to admit that it looked bad if the enemy patrols in these tunnels continued to increase. It should be remembered that they had not yet encountered a single humanoid monster, let alone one of the so-called Zorians. But after staring at the ground for a long time as if trying to see through it, Jake replied firmly, "We keep going." Sarah and his cousins were right below him, but how deep down, he couldn't tell at the moment. Until he found the base of the Zorians, there was no chance that his quest would be completed. Getting closer to the goal, the duo continued to fumble in the dark, exploring each new corridor in the hope that it would be the right one. Unsurprisingly, the number of enemies continued to grow, and so did their level of threat. The last wolf to pounce on them had required Jake's intervention to prevent Lu Yin from being disfigured. It was a very tough fellow. His telekinesis worked even less smoothly on it than on the Diplodocus, but this animal also had the particularity of being much faster and more alert. It seemed to be able to anticipate Jake's mental arrows and avoided them each time with a skillful leap. In the end, Jake lost patience and punched the wall beside him. The wall cracked, and after one more blow, some chipped volcanic rocks fell to the ground. Without delay, he picked up one of them, and like a baseball pitcher, his body stretched out like a bow before throwing the projectile at a speed comparable to that of a rifle bullet. Also accelerated by his telekinesis, the wolf caught the stone in the face, thus producing a deafening sound wave. The creature died immediately, but the noise brought all the monster patrols for kilometers around. It was even possible that some Zorians had been alerted. "Fuck," Jake grumbled beneath his breath. As soon as he had finished cursing their bad luck, the ground began to shake. A moment later, it was the same scene as Simba being chased by wildebeests in The Lion King, but the underground gallery version and in absolute darkness as a bonus. Running like a madman, Jake had long ago caught Lu Yin by the collar of her armor and had given up the idea of finding the prison where Sarah and the others had been taken. Given the army of monsters in these tunnels, it was simply impossible for them to advance any further. And even if they did, they still had to make their way back without alerting anyone. Literally impossible. "Do not let go of me in any way." Lu Yin cried out in panic when she saw another one of those ferocious beasts biting her boot. A kick in the mouth got rid of it, but she was sweating like crazy after that fright. "HMF. So what if I let go of you?" Jake lashed out, not forgetting to throw a soul arrow in the middle of the herd, followed by a telekinetic blast that crushed all the hearts of the creatures in its wake. As the creatures fell dead, the creatures in their wake stumbled and turned, and a pile-up ensued, offering them a brief respite. "Phew, and now we're leaving." "What? Where are you going?" Lu Yin panicked even more when Jake tossed her to the ground like a sack of potatoes. "I'm finishing the job. The ether doesn't wait," Jake said as he drew his machete once more with a predatory expression on his face. Turning around, he sprinted in a few swift strides towards the wrecked herd and cheerfully began to slice apart all the still living creatures, taking advantage of their confusion to sow death in their ranks. Chapter 295 Invincible. By the time the battle ended, a pool of blood about 5 centimeters deep had flooded the gallery in which Jake and Lu Yin were standing. A mountain of corpses had been erected in front of and behind them as monsters kept pouring in from both sides of the corridor. At first, Jake had taken advantage of the pileup and the turmoil in the enemy's ranks to slaughter them, But soon another tide of enemies had caught them in a pincer movement, blocking the other side of the gallery. Lu Yan, who thought she could escape the battle, was forced to join in, and it turned out that she was not as badly off as she claimed. She was wounded many times, of course, but after being sprayed with flint-red blood on numerous occasions, a reddish glow had started pulsating behind her dark golden iris, and her lucidity had then been given way to an unstoppable killing wrath. Jake wasn't outdone either. He thought he could resist this berserk state with the help of the green soul stone, but he had still taken great care to avoid enemy blood splashes because deep down he wasn't that confident. Indeed, after some repeated contact with the enemy's vital fluids, his own consciousness had twisted into an unbridled murderous rage. Thanks to the green soul stone, his lucidity had barely been sustained, or perhaps it was due to the recent progress of his spirit body and the increased resilience of his body and brain. Either way, he had held on, and this time he had been able to consciously experience the effects of this berserk mode. And the first word that came to his mind was awesome. He felt so overpowered in that state that he wished he could have stayed that way forever. His veins, rarely visible under his skin, had begun to glow as if all his blood had been suddenly replaced by the lava in the heart of the volcano. His irises and pupils had begun to emit the galactic light mixed with silver and gold that fed his golden spiritual eye skill, while his warrior and spiritual trance skill had reached a level never seen before. Under the influence of Flintium, or rather the red soul stone, his fighting aptitude had been magnified by at least a factor of 3. Enemy movements seemed slower and full of loopholes to exploit. His reflexes, strength and reaction time had almost tripled, while his control of the ether, heat, and earth was better than ever. Even the ether of the hard rock beneath his feet was bending to his command. Furthermore, the red bestial aura of his enemies had also become unable to hinder his telekinesis, nor any of his mental strikes. In the midst of these creatures, he was literally invincible. Unable to feel the slightest fear and driven by the program contained within the red crystals encasing their foreheads, these tides of hostile monsters had fearlessly sacrificed themselves by pouncing on them wave after wave without being able to survive for more than a second or two. The few beasts that managed to carry out an attack on Jake had not even been able to seriously injure him. The red marks on his skin were barely deeper than those that could have been left by a slightly teasing kitten. It was as if his Murtharian bloodline had been upgraded a few times at once, giving him a body of incomparable resilience. The battle had lasted several hours, with waves of enemies seemingly endless. But as Jake and Lu Yan waded deeper and deeper into the blood of their opponents, to the point of resembling two bloodily red humanoid demons, their killing intent had only grown stronger and stronger to the point of almost turning physical. When it had exceeded a certain threshold, the boundless fearlessness of these monsters had suddenly vanished. The visceral fear that should always have been there had returned in all its splendor, annihilating even the sole program that drove them to sacrifice. With a mental ripple from Jake, the crystals inserted in the foreheads of the still living monsters had then been reduced to dust, and having abruptly regained their cognitive faculties, the latter had immediately scrammed their tails between their legs. Despite this overwhelming victory, neither Jake nor Lu Yan had time to celebrate. Die! Lu Yan roared with absolute rage as she swung down her sword with all her might with the intention of slicing his body in half. Know your place. The target of this deadly attack snorted, revealing impressive, translucent fangs. Bam! Lu Yan slammed into the half-destroyed wall of the gallery more than 25 meters from where Jake was standing. This telekinetic blast had been so vicious that half of the young woman's bones had broken into dozens of pieces on the spot. And yet, even with such injuries, Lu Yan was still refusing to listen to reason that if she was spring-loaded. She instantly got up as if her injuries did not exist, and the creaking sound similar to crushed glass that followed was chilling. Cough, cough. I'm going to kill you. Lu Yan shouted again before darting at him while lifting a gust of wind in her wake. Bam! Unsurprisingly, she crashed back to square one a fraction of a second later. Jake was also possessed by an intense desire to kill, but a certain impatience was starting to build up inside him. Lu Yan, I am pressed for time. This is your last chance. After that, I won't be responsible for anything. It wasn't just empty words. From the beginning, he could hardly tolerate her company. So under the Flinchium's influence, it was a pure miracle that she was still breathing. Without the green soul stone allowing him to preserve a semblance of lucidity, he would probably have cut her into pieces along with the other monsters without even noticing. In his berserk state, Lu Yin was a fierce opponent, perhaps even strong enough to corner Jake in his normal state. But in his present form, defeating him was a dream that would never come true. Even if her strength miraculously doubled, the result would not change. He wasn't lying, either, when he pretended to be on the verge of losing control. He had thought of several ways to gently neutralize the young woman, whether by knocking her out or briefly choking her, but he had been forced to give up these peaceful solutions. If he really tried his Vader grip in his current state, Lu Yan's neck would simply explode. Still, this did not mean that he did not have a plan. Every time he pushed Lu Yan back, the direction in which she was thrown was not insignificant. By dint of repeated telekinetic blasts, he had managed to gradually draw both of them away from the previous battlefield. After this last beating, they had finally come out of the pool of blood. Here the gallery was clean and dried. If this was not enough to calm Lu Yan, he would be forced to kill her, or not far from that. Fortunately, Lu Yan was finally starting to feel the brunt of all her injuries. This time she did not manage to get up straight away, and this proved that the Red Soul Stone was not invincible. It stimulated their fighting skills, but no matter whether their regeneration had doubled or tripled, it would take time to repair a bone structure reduced to dust. Taking advantage of this respite, Jake retrieved his backpack and pulled out a canteen filled with water. He had to focus hard not to break the container because he wanted to destroy everything so badly, but he managed to remove the cork. He then spilled the water all over himself to rinse off the blood covering him, and it was only then that his inner rage subsided. His Murtharian bloodline quickly returned to its normal level, and his feeling of invincibility was immediately supplanted by a sense of acute tiredness, as if he had expended all the calories in his body. In fact, he had. His muscle mass had noticeably melted during these few hours of fighting, and his fat mass was bordering on 0%. In other words, he looked almost like a mummy. As for Lu Yan, to say that she could have made a blind man puke in disgust in her present state was an understatement. After having her bones pulverized, her appearance resembled that of a dehydrated mollusk. No wonder he had been unable to move a finger after that fighting night of the second trial. He probably looked like this back then. Once again fully in control of his abilities, Jake retrieved Lu Yan's canteen from her own bag and sprinkled her with water as well before she had time to react. The blood covering her was rinsed away, and the madness distorting her face faded away, giving way instead to a grimace of pain. "What has happened?" Lu Yan croaked in a dry voice, while opening her parched lips with difficulty. "Well, nothing much." Jake chuckled as he pointed to the two mountains of corpses behind them. Seeing this, Lu Yan's wounds suddenly relapsed, and she fainted instantly. Chapter 296, Second Rescue Attempt. The sad consequence of being drenched with Flinchium-rich blood was that they had won the battle, but they were no longer able to rescue their companions. In Jake's opinion, the ordeal of Lu Yan might even be over. Having a strong vitality had a downside. By the time the young woman woke up, which could take at least several hours, her bones would have already begun their healing process long ago. Given that her bones had been practically ground down to powder, the resulting anarchic scarring threatened to permanently incapacitate Lu Yan. If she didn't commit suicide immediately upon waking up after looking at herself in the mirror, her only hope for healing would be to re-break each of her bones to reposition them, which meant starting the recovery stage from scratch. Lu Yan had her ether of vitality capped at 100 points, while her body was not much different from that of a human athlete of similar morphology. Because of the world's ether density set at 40 points, her effective vitality was only 2.5 times higher than normal. When she injured her chest a few days earlier, she was able to accelerate her recovery by concentrating her ether of vitality in the injured areas to locally amplify her regenerative powers. Alas, her current condition was very different, since this time her entire body was in a critical state. Jake could still save her if he put his heart into it, but the situation did not allow him to take such a risk. If a Zorian, Nosk, or one of those humanoid monsters appeared right now, he would be in dire straits. The green soul stone may have limited his mental fatigue, but his body was a total wreck. He was so scrawny and dehydrated that he too could faint at any moment. It was not without reason that he had simply used his telekinesis to fend off Lu Yan's attacks. Somewhat frustrated, he glanced down one last time in the direction his shadow guide was pointing at. Then with a last weary sigh, he decisively turned back after picking up the pile of amorphous flesh corresponding to Lu Yan. A few minutes later, he was back at the entrance of the secret underground passage, and a starless night welcomed his return to the open air. While he was still wondering how to recover as soon as possible, Xi's voice echoed in his mind. "Your cousin Noemi is dead," she said in a solemn tone. Jake had instructed her to keep an eye on the player ranking and inform him of any changes. Spontaneously, he checked the player ranking, then tried to locate the girl with his shadow guide in vain. Like his uncle Elijah, she had disappeared to the point that even her dead body had become impossible to detect. During these few hours of fierce fighting, the number of participants still in contention had dropped drastically again. There were now just over 1,000 participants. At the rate at which the players were being eliminated, they might only be 100 in 2 or 3 days. The evening had only just begun, but the permanent darkness made such notions meaningless. Without his bracelet, he would have been unable to estimate the time. In any case, he needed to regain his strength first. Flying into the jungle, he scanned a patch of vegetation in search of prey, and as soon as a poor rabid smilodon entered his line of sight, he pulverized his skull with a stone propelled by his telekinesis. In order not to fall back into his berserk state and hasten his demise, he kept his distance crouched on the high branch of a tree and waited patiently for the creature to bleed to death. The flintium contained in the red blood cells made it difficult to manipulate it through telekinesis, but at least there was no longer any residual bestial aura. With a little insistence, he managed to disperse the blood enough to approach safely. Jake took great care to extract the remaining traces of blood and then made a tank with his powers and filled it with water at the nearest stream. He then dipped his machete in it to diffuse the energy of the green soul stone embedded in the pommel. The soul energy diffused into the liquid, and when he felt it was enough, he threw the carcass in to rinse it out. It was only after all these precautions that he began to munch on the raw monster without even bothering to light a fire. Now that all the creatures were under the soul stone's influence all over the island, lighting a campfire had become too dangerous. Without fear or emotion, all the beasts in the surrounding area would have swarmed in straight away. As big as the prehistoric feline could be, Jake's appetite was even bigger. By focusing his ether of vitality and constitution in his digestive system, he consumed dozens of kilograms of meat and bones until he felt horribly bloated. He then drank about 10 liters of water from the tank, and only then did he feel that his recovery was back on track. He then dug a hiding place for Lu Yan, which he dumped inside with the rest of the carcass as well as the tank of purified water. He then plugged the hole and flew directly to the top of the volcano. This was all he could do for the young woman, considering that he did not even care for her. If she was not discovered, she stood a chance of making it through. Of course, Jake hadn't given up on saving Sarah, Kevin, and Kate. His Murtharian bloodline prevented him from giving up such a challenge so easily. However, he now knew that it was probably impossible. What still motivated him was the mystery behind their capture and what these Zorians could get out of it. A moment later, he had found his makeshift cave back in the volcanic chamber, and he dug even deeper this time to come closer to the lava. After that, he buried himself again in crushed volcanic rock, but without losing consciousness this time. It took him almost 24 hours to restore his optimal musculature, the time it took for his body to metabolize all the food he had eaten and for the nutrients in the soil around him to be absorbed as well. His physical stats had increased by another 5 points on average, and this could be considered as a fair bonus. During his 24-hour nap, he had had plenty of time to analyze the situation more thoroughly, and the death struggle had not been so pointless. Some of these monsters were, in their berserk form, opponents that presented a real threat to him. Without flintium, he could never have defeated such an army, and he would have retreated long before. Moreover, the unshakable rage to kill that this gave him had a good synergy with the Myrmidian part of his bloodline. The direct consequence was that his stagnant ether stats had progressed markedly. Ether status. Strength, S 231.6 points. 202/U003 E2 31.6. Agility, a 230.3 points, 199.6/U003 E2 30.3. Constitution, C 224.6 points, 186/U003 E2 24.6. Vitality, V 227.4 points, 188/U003 E2 27.4. Intelligence, I 233.2 points, 216.3/U003 E2 33.2. Perception, P 224.6 points, 214.2/U003 E2 24.6. Extrasensory perception, EP 223.9 points, 212.4/U003 E2 23.9. Jake was not so confident in his chances of success, but with his recent progress he had to give it a try. He didn't feel invincible, but at least he had the conviction that he would be able to run away safely in case something unexpected happened. With a shake, he got rid of the ashes covering him and returned for the third time in a row to the entrance of the secret underground passage. He expected to find a new dinosaur standing guard there, but there was no one around, although the Diplodocus's carcass had vanished. This aroused his suspicion, but it wasn't enough to dissuade him. Without hesitation, Jake dashed towards the entrance and then blended into the darkness of the labyrinth. He was prepared to meet new monster patrols, but the corridors were deserted too. His victim's blood from the previous day had dried up, while the stench of rotting corpses had begun to reek. Holding his nose, Jake continued to move forward until he found the site of the previous day's deadly battle where he and Lu Yin had risked their lives. Knowing that this was the only path he had not been able to fully explore, he continued in that direction, and unsurprisingly a few minutes later, he discovered a staircase going down even lower. This spiral staircase had been carved out of the rock and seemed to have no end, but he knew in his heart that it was the only way to find Sarah and his two cousins. The shadow guide should have been able to direct them to this staircase as soon as he wished to find his comrades. But again, the oracle had proved unreliable. He didn't have any conclusions to draw yet, but he had the feeling that the soul stones had something to do with it. As soon as there was a high density of these minerals in the area, the oracle's predictions seemed to fall short. It took him longer to descend the spiral staircase than it did to cross the network of galleries that had led him here, but when Jake arrived downstairs, the grandiose spectacle in front of him made the trip worthwhile. A gigantic underground city, but this one was not in ruins. Yet, far from teeming with Zorians and monsters as he had mentally braced himself for, there wasn't a soul living for kilometers around. The city was as deserted and silent as a ghost town. Chapter 297 Zorian City. He was about to begin his infiltration when Shi's voice resounded in his mind again. At her tone, he knew right away that something serious had just happened. Lu Yin is dead. What? Jake exclaimed aloud, practically ruining all his efforts at discretion with a single word. That was great news. Not really. Taking the information more seriously, he quickly became gloomy again. How long had it been since he had abandoned Lu Yin? Not much more than a day. Even if she was awake, she should still be recovering in the crypt he had made for her. How could she have died so quickly? Had she tried to come out of her hiding place and a player or an enemy creature had found her? Or was her hiding place not so good and a player or a passing monster discovered her while she was still unconscious? Last possibility, she had died from her wounds before regaining consciousness. It was unlikely but possible. After all, he hadn't even bothered to make her drink any water. None of these assumptions were frightening for him. What Jake dreaded was that a Zorian might have tracked them all the way back to this place after their carnage the day before. He could not guarantee with certainty that the blood of these monsters did not contain some kind of beacon. Unless these aliens could detect flinchium, the pores of their skin must have absorbed a fair amount of it during the battle. The traces of red soul stone present in his body had long since been neutralized by his own green soul stone, but Lu Yin did not have that privilege. As soon as Jake left her, it was possible that the flinchium in her body that he had been unable to flush out had begun to radiate again. Instinctively, this reasoning made sense to him. But if Azorian had really murdered her, With its intelligence, it must have immediately realized that it was impossible for the young woman to get out of the underground galleries by herself in her condition. It was easy to deduce that she had a teammate, and it was likely to draw attention to him. I recommend hurrying in this case. Zorians are scarier than you think. If they killed her, they can find you too. She warned him with some anxiety. What makes you say that? Did another memory come back? Jake interjected with some doubt. I think so. It's still unclear, but I'm sure that locating you is a piece of cake. The fact that they haven't yet specifically attacked you is probably not coincidental, but by your action you've caught their attention. In this case, let's not waste time. Jake muttered resolutely. He was now in a gigantic underground basement about 10 kilometers in diameter. A painted dome-shaped roof several hundred meters high formed the equivalent of their celestial vault. Fluorescent crystals embedded in the rock gave the impression of looking at a starry sky. These stars were crimson in color. They were flintium crystals, or rather unmined red soul stones. It was the first time he saw soul stones of harvestable size, except for the one forming the pommel of his machete. The rest of the time, they were massive and impossible to extract or displace. If he didn't have the revitalizing and neutralizing soul energy of his green soul stone continuously feeding his soul, he might have already lost his mind. As for the city in front of him, the architecture was reminiscent of the Aztecs or the Mayans, but the colorimetry was dark and sinister, oscillating between shades of dark red and gray-black. The streets were paved, with lanterns fueled by other luminescent crystals enveloping the city in a subdued glow. Still, the technology seemed rather archaic, not to say primitive. It was hard to believe that these Zorians had been able to build these sanctuary bubbles and then live in these conditions. Nevertheless, all the structures were made of stone, and their mastery of metallurgy seemed rather advanced, as evidenced by the few pipes snaking along the houses like big earthworms. A paradox. He thought that his arrival at the foot of the stairs would have attracted the attention of the inhabitants, or at least of a sentry in charge of security, but he was truly alone. Even his previous shout of surprise hadn't triggered any reaction. Shrugging his shoulders, he decided that this was a good thing for him and immediately proceeded to explore. Jake progressed slowly at first out of caution. He walked along the walls of the closest buildings, pausing at each blind spot or transition between shadows to inspect the surroundings. None of these buildings had windows, and this prevented him from being able to say for certain whether the houses were empty. Under the circumstances, he did not have the luxury of checking. After a few moments, when he realized that he was really alone, he relaxed and his speed increased significantly. The side quest he had accepted had begun to update itself in real time as he made more discoveries, but the mystery was not yet considered solved. He was, however, eligible for a reward. If he left now, though, his reward would likely be mediocre. When Jake had moved about 2 kilometers into the city, he noticed a change in the scenery. The paved streets were wider and generally cleaner. The materials also seemed to be of better quality, that a kind of reddish gold covered some of the frontages and facades, and the buildings no longer lacked windows. It was like the transition from a poor neighborhood to a richer one. This section of the city also seemed deserted, but open-air stalls still covered with general merchandise indicated that until recently, this place must have been bustling with activity like any shopping mall on a weekend. What the hell is going on here? Jake whispered inwardly with a bad feeling. As he approached one of the stalls, he glanced at the merchandise on display, and his face instantly distorted in horror. Freshly decapitated heads were floating in a cast iron container in a red liquid that was still warm due to the high temperatures in the cellar. All these heads belonged to monsters from the island or strange aliens. But one of these faces clearly belonged to a human, and the most horrible thing about it was that this face was familiar to him. It was his cousin Noemi's. A few months earlier, Jake would probably have puked his guts out at such a scene, but instead it was an intense fury that overwhelmed him. The light emitted by the red crystals of the lanterns around him suddenly intensified, as if these crystals were responding to his sudden emotional outburst. His fangs lengthened, his veins glowed like lava, and his irises sparkled like galaxies under the influence of these lights. But a brief contact between his palm and the pommel of his machete was enough to reverse the process and restore his lucidity. Looking back on what almost happened, Jake got goosebumps. A few seconds more, and he would have lost his mind. If he wasn't sure that the crystals were made of flintium, he now knew for sure. He had also just discovered that the red soul stones could amplify emotions. His short-lived anger had briefly surpassed the neutralizing abilities of his green stone. Quickly circling the marketplace, Jake quickly confirmed that all the foodstuffs sold were primarily blood-based. The blood-filled container with heads floating inside reminded him of some sangria or punch recipes, except that the alcohol had been replaced by blood and the fruit slices by heads. The other stands offered other homemade recipes, but each of them was more disgusting than the next. As he began to feel extremely uncomfortable, his feeling of foreboding became clearer as well. Without wasting any more time, he set off again. Jake had thought there was still time because Sarah and the others were still alive, but now he knew that their elimination from the ordeal was hanging by a thread. Judging by the terror grimace on his cousin's face, she would probably remember that death for the rest of her life. The clearer space in the marketplace had allowed him to notice a building in the distance that was larger than the others, and his gut was telling him that this was the direction in which he should go. His shadow guide also indicated that Sarah was there. The building in question looked like some kind of ancient Mayan pyramid and was at the other end of the cave. It took him more than half an hour to approach it safely, but the unexpected cries of an ecstatic crowd confirmed that he had finally reached his destination. Hidden behind a kennel-like building, Jake caught a glimpse inside, through the rare air vents, of nightmarish four-legged creatures whose glowing eyes reflected the madness within. Holding his breath, he then crawled up the kennel wall to lie flat on the roof behind a statue of what he thought was a Zorian child. Satisfied with his hiding place and a high, clear field of vision, he was finally able to look at what was capturing the crowd's attention to the point of making them frenzied. These aliens did indeed look like red-eyed dark elves as they had been described to him. In other words, Zorians. He had finally met them in the flesh. Choosing to ignore them, he followed their gaze, and when he realized what they were looking at, his heart temporarily stopped beating in his chest. Chapter 298 Sorry. At the center of this crowd, hundreds of humanoid aliens of various appearances were on their knees, chained at the foot of an altar forged in one piece from an enormous red crystal. From their motley appearances and the presence of a few humans in the group, including Sarah and his cousins, Jake knew right away that they were players. Dried blood had impregnated the altar, as had the slabs of the plaza. Some human-sized buckets contained severed limbs and heads, while others appeared to be filled with a thick liquid of different colors. At first, Jake naively thought it might be some kind of paint, but the unmistakable metallic stench left little doubt as to the nature of the liquid. It was blood. After all, red was not the only possible color. The color of blood could be red, green, purplish pink, blue, and even white, depending on what type of metal atom the metalloproteins in the red blood cells or plasma were made of. On the scale of the mirror universe, this variety of color was even greater than on Earth, and there was enough different blood in those buckets to paint a rainbow. So many of them were captured, Jake shuddered in amazement as he stared at the sight in front of him. The crowd was ecstatic, chanting in rhythm a kind of tribal song with a foot tapping. Jake was somewhat baffled to see that most of these Zorians looked malnourished and famished. Their faces were emaciated and their muscles gaunt. The average age seemed very high, and there were virtually no children in the crowd. In their zealous eyes and toothy smiles, Jake could detect a kind of fanaticism and a troubling appetite. As if the prisoners in front of them were not living beings worthy of respect, but cattle, or rather the embodiment of a hope for which they were willing to commit the worst atrocities. As for the prisoners, they were even more miserable. Most of them had pale and bloodless faces, as if they had lost a lot of blood during their captivity, or perhaps as if they had been deprived of sleep. Each tap of the crowd's foot on the ground made them startle with terror, as if all their pride and ferocity had vanished when they were brought here. Jake was able to confirm that Sarah and Kevin were not yet in the same decrepit state as the majority of the prisoners, but this could be blamed on their more recent capture. Nevertheless, their expressions were austere and desperate. Although they appeared calm, Jake could sense the distress in their eyes. Clearly, they had already tried everything to escape in vain. His cousin Kate, on the other hand, had red eyes after crying her eyes out. The terrified grimace on Noemi's severed head was still fresh in his memory, and there was no doubt that it must have been a traumatic experience for the two women who were usually as thick as thieves. As he began to pay attention to the other prisoners, the crowd suddenly stopped singing and instead started chanting a name as they turned toward the temple like pyramid at the bottom of the cave. The pyramid in question was probably as large as the famous pyramid of Cheops, but instead of a human-sized entrance doorway, a rectangular hole several tens of meters high and 10 meters wide had been dug directly into the monument. Trying to look inside, Jake felt like he was trying to peer into the darkness. Like a black hole, no light seemed to escape from the depths of the building. Instead of their ecstatic shouts, a drumbeat resounded from inside the temple, and soon a middle-aged Zorian, about 2 meters high, came into view at its entrance. His skin was even darker than that of the other Zorians, but his muscles were sharp and chiseled like those of a statue of a Greek god. He wore a long black priest's robe, and a pendant ending in a red crystal the size of a tangerine adorned his thick, ox-like neck. His pupils glowed the same color and carried a vicissitude in them that Yerode and Lamine would not have envied. In his calloused hand, a long scimitar with precious stones and an inscribed blade hinted at its purpose. As expected, the priest and perhaps city leader began to walk slowly toward the altar in the center of the crowd. Most of the prisoners recognized him with fright, so much so that even the most fragile ones pissed themselves upon seeing him. Jake was completely shocked by the sight. After enduring the first and second trials, the remaining contestants were supposed to be the toughest-minded players among 11 million contestants. They were supposed to be smiling in the face of a torture session, no matter how gory it was. Even Jake had been eaten alive several times before slowly adapting to the battle at sea. Except for a few extremely talented or lucky players with a specific skill that had helped them overcome that first trial, everyone else had gone through the same agony before reaching shore. Therefore, it was all the more disturbing for him to see that even Sarah and Kevin were shaking at the mere appearance of this individual. This made him even more hesitant about trying to save them. One mistake, and he would end up like them in sacrifice with a chain around his neck. Jake reassured himself mentally by clenching the handle of his machete so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He was also sweating quite a bit, although he wasn't aware of it at all. Seeing the priest Zorian advancing nonchalantly toward the crowd and looking only at the altar in front of him, Jake was tempted to launch a surprise attack, but another movement in the periphery of his field of vision immediately dissuaded him from doing so. Seconds after the priest left the temple, a clawed hand the size of a minivan burst out of the darkness inside the temple and grabbed one of the walls demarcating the entrance, as if the creature owning that hand needed support to stand upright. In the next moment, Jake watched with growing disbelief as the largest humanoid monster he had ever seen in his entire life appeared. Even in video games or movies, such a monster was not often pictured on screen. Slowly crawling out of the darkness of the temple, the monster crept out of the pyramid with difficulty, and once outside, it stood up, shaking the cave with every move it made. Once upright, its skull was almost touching the vault that formed the ceiling at the top of the cave. It was the same dark and hairless humanoid monster that Jake had fought during his second trial, except that this creature was not 10 or 15 meters high, but the height of a skyscraper. Its eyes were not green but red, and a bathtub-sized rock of flinchium hung around its neck. The rope that made up the pendant was a thick steel chain, the kind used to make the anchor of the largest ocean liners. Once on its feet, the goofy-faced monster swept across the city as if it was scanning the entire cave with infrared light, and for a split second Jake's eyes met those of the creature. At that moment, his mind went blank, and he felt as if his brain was about to explode. Fortunately, just as he was starting to realize the full extent of the danger, the monster's gaze continued on its way, totally unaware of the measly microbe it had almost destroyed with a single glance. It took a few seconds for Jake to recover, and he realized that he was shaking and sweating almost as much as the prisoners in the middle of the crowd. This had to be the most scary thing he had ever met in his entire life. Even the brain eater devouring the brain of the hero mermaid in the first ordeal had not left him with such an impression. Well, one had to admit that the Oracle had saved him just in time back then. Jake thought that with such a bodyguard, the priest already had nothing to fear, but he had underestimated the prudence of this Zorian. After this giant monster, about 100 similar aliens crawled out of the temple. None of them were so ridiculously large and overpowered, but their size gave him no cause for celebration either. The smallest was almost 10 meters tall, and several of them were more than 50 meters high. On top of that, these creatures were not naked and wore full armor forged in some black alloy. Only their bald skulls and long, pointed ears were exposed. Each of them also had a red soul stone around their necks. Clearly in charge of the priest's safety, these creatures spread out in a tight line around the crowd. Only the first monster remained respectfully behind the priest in charge of the ceremony. Witnessing this implausible scene, Jake had long been slack-jawed. Any doubts he still had about saving his companions had vanished. He was brave, but not suicidal. "Sorry, guys, but I won't be able to save you this time. I sincerely hope that your death will be quick and painless. See you on B842. Chapter 299, The Three Tribes. It was not because he was insensitive or selfish that he behaved this way, but because he sincerely believed that rescuing them was impossible. In fact, he even wondered if he would be able to get to the surface without a hitch. As if to confirm his premonition, when he wished to safely return to the surface, his shadow guide didn't simply turn back as he had hoped. On the contrary, it lay even lower against the roof of the kennel, taking full advantage of the width of the statue next to him to hide even more perfectly. Basically, if Jake wanted to survive, he had to stay here. Of course, it was on the assumption that his bracelet was working properly. It was far from being the first time that the Oracle system had failed him. Whatever, the quest he had accepted was still active, so even if he was stuck in this underground city for a while, he might as well take advantage of it to complete his mission. As long as he avoided attracting the attention of these monsters, he didn't have much to fear. As Jake tried to cope with the stress of being stuck here, the Zorian priest in the middle of the crowd suddenly raised his hands in the air to ask for silence. The crowd had long since fallen silent, but the drumbeat from the temple ceased shortly after his gesture. Then the alien spoke. "Dear chosen people, the hour of our ascension is at hand. The long-awaited glory for our tribe is imminent, and once again we, the Zorians of Chaos, will crush our brethren from the tribes of Harmony and Dream." At the last descent of the Phantom Sanctuary, our city obtained 38 places. 38 brave Zorians who managed to fly away of their own wings and were able to leave this island, which shackles us. By sacrificing these parasites of another world to the ancient designer, we will obtain the force needed to finally surpass our enemies. At the end of this vehement opening, the silent crowd loudly roared in concert, their combined voices shaking the stone buildings with the intensity of a tsunami. Their red eyes glowed intensely, responding to the deep, hypnotic voice of their guru. Even Jake, who was more than 100 meters from the crowd, felt a patriotic emotion bursting from the depths of his soul. Had he been closer, perhaps he would have volunteered to become a sacrifice. This priest was elegant, his voice appealing and pleasant, while every word he said seemed to resonate in his heart. If he wasn't sure he was straight, he might have doubted his heterosexuality. "What the hell is that?" Jake cursed under his breath as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. How can this alien be so enthralling? A high charm or charisma stat, combined with a powerful spirit body and a mental-type ether skill. It could also come from a soul skill or the effect of a glyph. She explained without the slightest surprise. She seemed to have anticipated that such a situation would occur at some point. "What can I do to defend myself? If I don't do anything, I'm stuck here. I can't get any closer, and if he sees me, I'm afraid to surrender on my own if he asks me nicely." It is indeed problematic. You don't know any ether soul skill, but now that you're expecting it, you just need to focus on your spirit body to perceive and maintain control of your ether. If you can prevent these fluctuations from reaching your consciousness or your brain, you should be fine. Easier said than done. Jake snorted inwardly. "You are stronger than you think, so focus." She encouraged him with a restless tone as she saw his pessimistic attitude. Remember the Murtharian mentality. Never give up. Right. Even if he failed, he should not admit defeat or his ether stats would drop accordingly. Using violence, Jake forced himself into meditation like when he was trying to create his ether core and quickly managed to ignore the hypnotic influence of the priest Zorian to focus on the infinite and versatile variations of the ether particles floating all around him. As soon as he silenced his mind and used the full power of his extrasensory perception to analyze these etheric fluctuations, another perspective opened up to him. By using his physical senses, a sound or image could evoke emotions or thoughts in him, while by focusing on the nature of things, only vibrations or electromagnetic waves remained. These sounds and colors suddenly became much less attractive once under the prism of his intellect. And by the simple act of meditation, he broke away from the influence on his emotions that this discourse had aroused. While scrutinizing the ether in his own spirit body, Jake noticed how high-frequency ether waves were hitting his spirit body multiple times per second. When they impacted his spirit body, his own ether would vibrate and resonate against his will, and ripples would then spread to the center of his spirit body where his soul and the heart of his consciousness was located. By retracting his spirit body into his brain, the effect was even more pronounced to the point of altering his own neurochemistry. No, it's not going to work. Jake fought back as he watched his spirit body gradually become corrupted by these foreign ether waves. There had to be a way to counteract this attack. He had been able to directly take the Nosk mental blast because his spirit body was resilient enough. But here the method used was completely different. This ether skill was not trying to harm or damage him, but trying to sway him without his knowledge. By analyzing the enemy's ether waves colliding with the edge of his spirit body for the umpteenth time, an idea came to him. Why don't I do the same? Slightly redeploying his spirit body to take control of the ether around him, Jake used his own ether control to repeatedly push out the ether around him. As if his body was in the center of a shock wave, the surrounding ether was expelled at high speed away from him and quickly collided with the enemy's underhanded attack. The collision site was too far away for him to perceive what was happening, but he immediately felt the effect of the enemy's ether skill weakening. As soon as he partially escaped this sinister influence, his control over his own ether grew stronger, and his retaliation became more adept and increased in frequency to rival that of the enemy's mental attack. Ultimately, Jake was unable to attain the same frequency as the enemy ether, proving that this Zorian had higher mental stats and a superior spirit body than his own. No matter what he did, he was unable to completely rid himself of the deleterious influence on his mind, but it was enough to keep him lucid. Jake was aware that he was far from emulating the enemy's technique. He still didn't know how it worked, and by what wonder this attack was made possible. The ether skill of this Zorian did not throw the ether as he did. Something was traveling through the ether, separating them at a very high frequency, and it was this something that was affecting him without him being able to do anything about it. His counterattack had only broken the flow of the surrounding ether to prevent this mysterious force from spreading. Jake felt like he had struggled for hours to regain control of his body and thoughts, but in truth it hadn't been more than 5 minutes. When an evolver with his intelligence and spirit body was giving his best, the time went about 5 to 10 times slower. If he had been on Earth with an ether density of 10, that number would have been increased between 25 and 50 times. When Jake turned his attention back to the priest, he noticed that the alien had already finished his speech. He had missed everything. Aside from knowing that these Zorians belonged to the Chaos tribe and that they were in conflict with 2 other tribes, he was still as ignorant as ever. Anyway, based on the green eyes and the green soul stone of the Zorian monster he had met during his second trial, the existence of different types of Zorians and tribes made sense. And if these differences reflected the function of each of these soul stones, the names of these tribes were an even more obvious clue. These red-eyed Chaos Zorians were belligerent and barbaric in their behavior and primitive in their morals. The Flintium altar suited them well, and it was no wonder that the crowd was kneeling in front of the crystal as if they were worshipping it. Speaking of worship, who was this ancient designer? A god? Or maybe another Zorian from an ancient time? It could even be another alien if he referred to the heroes behind the myths of his first ordeal. Jake was still immersed in his reflections when the priest in the middle of the crowd started to ascend the altar. As soon as he set foot on the huge crystal, a reddish light network lit up the platform where the crystal stood, and a luminous structure as complex as an integrated circuit unfolded. An invisible but tangible energy began to gush out of the altar, engulfing the priest inside. Soon an abject bestial aura began to radiate from the Zorian bathed in this energy, and his body began to change. In a few seconds, his height increased by 50 centimeters, his black hair grew up to his ankles, and the veins on his muscles began to snake under his skin like big earthworms. From his shoulder blades, two gray, membranous wings spread out, while his long claws and pointed canines gave him a new demonic appearance impossible to associate with the old one. But the most shocking detail was not this physical mutation. During this transformation, a familiar object had openly materialized on one of his wrists. A bracelet. Chapter 300 Extraction. Recognizing the object on the alien's wrist, Jake didn't immediately make the connection. After all, jewelry was not the exclusive preserve of Earthlings, and what was the likelihood that this bracelet, although similar to his, was an oracle device? In fact, when Jake squinted his eyes to better distinguish its details, he immediately noticed the differences. The smooth, dark texture of the metal making up the bracelet was similar, but the shape of the object was different. Rather than the width of a connected watch, this bracelet had more the profile of a patch of armor covering the forearm like a vambrace. This plate covered the right forearm of the Zorian priest from the wrist to the elbow joint, and at this point it could not be called a bracelet. Bathed in the soul energy emitted by the crystal altar, this previously invisible accessory had suddenly revealed itself as the metallic liquid oozed from the pores of the priest's skin during its transformation. The scene was very similar to what happened when an evolver decided to intentionally reveal his own oracle device. An explanation? Jake whispered in disbelief as he was plagued by doubt. Luckily, the priest's yelling in berserk mode largely covered his inadvertent whispering. I don't know any more than you do. Jake found his AI's tone hesitant, but he didn't insist. If she didn't want to answer, there was no way he could get it out of her. As he wondered how long this farce would last, the Zorian priest stopped roaring and turned to stare at the crowd. However, the altar was not deactivated. The invisible energy, so dangerous for the players without Green Soul Stone, was still emitting. The fact that this energy was invisible instead of radiating a compelling red light, like anything containing flintium at night, indicated that this energy was of a different nature. Without being certain, the kind of formation inscribed on the ground, which emitted an intense scarlet light, must have had a purifying role to play. Bathed in this energy with a serene expression, the Zorian priest spread his arms and nodded to one of his fellow countrymen in armor to bring the prisoners. While a player resembling some kind of interbreeding between a batrachian and a chimpanzee was struggling and howling in fear as he was forcibly dragged to the altar with his chains, this priest flashed an evil and falsely benevolent smile at his worshippers. This individual seems pitiful, but by his sacrifice he allows our tribute to flourish. Contemplate this poor creature and offer it all your gratitude. For through it you will live. Its flesh will become your flesh. Its blood will become your blood. Its knowledge will become ours, and if its ability is good it will even be able to serve the order of chaos until the end of time. As good devotees, the crowd of Zorians made a pious bow in the direction of the wretched participant, who continued groaning and roaring with helplessness and despair. His body was thin and pale, and it was clear that he had already suffered some abuse before. Taking more blood from him could very well lead to his death. Despite his apparent terror, this prisoner had not given up his life. In spite of his restlessness, this player struggled tirelessly with all his strength, as if he had decided that he would fight until his last breath. Jake hoped that his cousin Noemi had shown the same courage before ending up in a broth, but he doubted it. In fact, she had. It was what followed that extinguished her will and dignity. As soon as the monkey batrachian alien was thrown on the crystal altar, he instantly stopped struggling. Like Jake and Lu Yin under the flintium effect, his spirit body underwent a change of atmosphere, and a beastly, murderous aura erupted from the depths of his soul. The etheric code of his bloodline ignited on contact with this invisible spark, and his appearance began to alter just as ludicrously as that of the Zorian priest. In a matter of seconds, this player, which was not particularly imposing at the base, began to grow uncontrollably and quickly surpassed 5 meters in height. A Spinosaurus-like membranous collar grew along its spine, and its hitherto tiny tail became long and flexible enough to be used as a weapon. It was always the same alien. But while he once looked like a juvenile, His current appearance was clearly that of an adult at the peak of his evolution. Jake wondered what would happen if a human earthling, without any etheric bloodline, came in contact with this energy. Perhaps his aura would change, and his musculature would increase grossly, but he doubted that such a physical mutation could occur, unless there was some other secret behind this altar. Nevertheless, at that very moment, the prisoner in the middle of the altar didn't care about that. Under the Flinchium's influence, the participant had completely lost his mind, and only a murderous impulse was glowing behind his pupils. Roar. With a bestial roar that generated a slight shock wave, the player, who had become as big as a giant, freed himself from his chains by brutally contracting his muscles. The steel chains that were clearly not designed to imprison such a monster instantly yielded with a big snap. Jake was stunned by this display of raw power, but he was even more shocked to see that the other prisoners kept displaying the same desperate expressions. Having experienced the incredible power-up from the Red Soul Stone firsthand, a prolonged contact with such pure energy had probably multiplied the player's capabilities immeasurably. At the very least, Jake was certain that he couldn't break these chains by brute force, or his cousin Kevin would have escaped long ago. There was even a chained Nosk among them. It was not as desperate as the other prisoners, but it too was unable to escape. Visibly aware of the danger, its skull had been shaved to the bone. Without any dendrites, its fighting skills were severely diminished, not to say crippled. Realizing that something would soon end the insurgency of the rabid player, Jake opened his eyes wide not to miss any details. And indeed, what happened next was truly the most desperate and anticlimactic execution he had ever seen. The priest Zorian, who despite his height of 3 meters looked like a child next to the player, flapped his wings to get some distance and snapped his fingers. A tenth of a second later, a clawed finger as large as a century-old tree trunk fell from the sky, like a meteor, and smashed the Batracian alien down to the ground. The humanoid monster the size of a skyscraper watching over the city had made its move. With its forefinger in place, the stunned player experienced the excruciating pain of having his spine and internal organs reduced to mush. He was unable to free himself. This finger was like a heavenly pillar, impossible to resist. Just after this incident, the Zorian priest landed gently onto the ground with his sacrificial scimitar in his hand. With a condescending smile, the alien grabbed the player by his hair, which was as slippery as seaweed, and forced him to meet his gaze. The change came lightning fast. His murderous rage, which was already fading because of the pain, vanished instantly, replaced by the same terror that still inhabited the decapitated head of his cousin Noemi. Jake realized that the priest was just having fun. With such control of his ether, the priest could have neutralized him from the beginning. Letting him out of his chains was a sick whim that could only come from the mind of a degenerate. The execution was carried out as he expected, albeit not exactly. While Jake was expecting the Zorian priest to slit the player's throat or decapitate him, he did something unforeseen. He cut off the prisoner's arm. It was only then that Jake noticed that just like the priest before him, the bracelet had forcibly materialized upon contact with the Flinchium. Because of this, the Zorian had easily identified where the bracelet was hidden. Aird. When the player's hand was cut off and the bracelet was lost, his gaze went blank for a brief moment, and he suddenly began to scream. The pain of the dismemberment could not explain this. Jake himself felt an inexplicable uneasiness when he witnessed this, and it was clear that this player had received a notification from his oracle system. Whatever it was, it had caused this participant to lose all his sanity, as if his only hope had just slipped away forever. Unconsciously, Jake rubbed his wrist where his own bracelet was hidden. He hated the oracle, but paradoxically, he was in no hurry to find out what happened when it was taken from him. He had been lucky enough to absorb the metal contained in another player's bracelet, but he didn't care about the consequences for the latter at the time. But the worst was yet to come. Instead of beheading the prisoner, the priest Zorian picked up the arm and pressed his bracelet against the player's. The light of the integrated circuit running through the altar intensified as if a switch had been turned on, and the player's bracelet, which had been solid until then, liquefied as it had on the first day. Except that instead of being absorbed by the priest's bracelet as Jake had imagined, the liquid simply dripped down the altar and then flowed into grooves intended for this purpose that he had not noticed until then. The metallic liquid seeped inside, and continued to trickle down until it completely disappeared from his sight. Once the extraction was completed, the priest repeated the process, cutting each limb off one by one and harvesting each bone and organ as well as the blood into dedicated containers. Each time, the Zorian would pass his bracelet over it, and the liquid behind the bracelet's functions would leak out, although in smaller quantities. The prisoner was never beheaded. He simply died when he had only one head left.